So we've had a good introduction to the varieties and crops that you might be growing. So we'll now start to move into, the inputs there. So yeah, thinking about how you can optimise the fungicides that you're going to be applying and what your main risks are. And clearly at the moment, weather is kind of front and central of our minds in terms of the challenges that our crops are facing. But we've got that kind of backdrop of kind of high establishment costs, high input costs, and again, the backdrop that pesticides are slower to come through the system, more challenging to develop, and we have resistance issues around the fungicides that are kind of eroding some of the actives that we've been familiar with. I do have one new active to present today, which is always exciting, but as ever, I'll caveat that with that kind of concern about resistance, and in some scenarios, we're at the very limits of what we can do to manage with fungicides. So it's how we can take a new active and then use it and steward it and other products for the longer term. So I'll do the usual canter through wheat, barley and oilseed rape, and then Dave is very strict about allowing time for questions at the end. So weather charts are always, illustrative. So just to give you the kind of context for last year and the scenario that we're going into this year, we've got the rainfall last March relative to the average. And then you can see that we went from, into the kind of a very wet start there, which delayed our spring barley drilling. And then we moved into that dry period in May, which was further challenging to our spring barley crops. It did dry up some of the disease, but we still had quite established disease in the winter crops. And then, of course, we moved back into a wet summer and quite a challenging harvest, so almost a mirror image of the previous year. And then, of course, for the autumn, we've then moved into the succession of storms that has been, particularly concerning around some of our main crop areas in the Forfar area. So you see there the autumn rainfall and some of the challenges that has brought. So we're going into a fairly tricky season going forward. For the crop health issues of last year, we had quite a sort of spectrum of disease in trials, although again, the weather drove some of your major challenges. So that kind of feature of secondary tillering and spring barleys, screening and quality issues around ears and some of the ear diseases that we saw as well was the kind of backdrop of diseases that we had. But we're beginning to see quite a spread of diseases in those cereal crops. So while Septoria in wheat and Rhynchosporium in barley remain your main targets, we're beginning to see, more mildew and also some of these, if you like, more minor pathogens. So things like tan spot and ascochyta creeping into crops. So we're just developing quite a spectrum there. Yellow rust becoming increasingly challenging even into this area where traditionally we've thought we were at lower risk. So many of you have been good enough to report issues with yellow rust around this area. I'll touch on mildew a bit because we suspect there's something going on with the specific mildewiscides, so kind of poorer control coming through in reports from the field. And we no longer test for specific mildewiscides in the fungicide performance trials. We cut them in budget limitations and because we weren't getting very much mildew, and we've had it in the trials every year since. So I'll come back to the kind of efficacy that you get from some of the standard programs. So anyway, that's the challenging backdrop that we're looking at. And then we're obviously using trial evidence to then present the data that you want to know about the fungicides. And within that, it's the AHDB's fungicide performance series that's really key in that sort of side-by-side comparison of fungicides. So we do this with colleagues at ADAS, Chuggas and NIAB and Harper Adams to produce these charts. They're always a little bit challenging to look at. I'm relieved that the colours have come through all right on my slides. But just to flag that all the slides for today are available on the FAS website. So if you look under the news tab, the presentations are all there, so you can peruse at your leisure. But if we just spend a minute or two on these fungicide performance curves for Septoria protection, And you're probably reasonably familiar in that the best curves come into that tight corner so that we get low levels of disease at quite low levels of fungicide concentration. And you can see that for Septoria protection, these are reasonably tight curves, but you see some of that drift for the straight products. So that just to get your eye in to what we're looking at. Yes, the type here is slightly challenging, so it's testing my memory. But just to pick out the key points for you, the two solo points that you see at the top there are Arizona in red and prothioconazole in blue. So that's a full dose of those products. And you can see there that they are helpful, but they are toiling in and of themselves. At this side, you have your mixture products. So you see there pulling to the front, it's Astra, Revistar, and Imtrek. No, I'm going to have to remind myself. So Revistar is still looking good when it comes to protection there. And then for your straight products, the new one to point out there in green is Vimoy. So this is the new SDHI from Bayer, which is looking comparable to your other good straight products. So that's exciting to have a new SDHI straight, but it's an SDHI, so it's in the same family of chemistry. So I'll come on to how we can steward that going forward. Now, it will be marketed with a prothioconazole as a mixture, so that what I've pulled out here, the ratio changed during the trial series, which I'm not presenting the mixture data for Vimoy. But you see here just the straight data pulled out from 2022, the full dose data. So you can see Iblon, which is Vimoy, with prothioconazole there, and you see it straight at the end of the chart there. So it's looking very comparable to some of your other best products for Septoria. So that's an encouraging position to be in. And then when we look at the over-year data, and this is one of the strengths of the fungicide performance programme, that we are looking at, kind of solid-looking data. So again, just to pick out the Revistar Univoc curves there, Univoc is still coming to the front when it comes to that Revistar comparison. I think people have got used to obviously we had some sprayer issues in the first season of use, but that message about not leaving it sitting in sprayers and using higher water volumes, or certainly not using reduced water volumes, I think has led to fewer issues over the last year. So technically still slightly ahead. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, helpful to point. So there you see Univoc Revistar, relevant relative to the Revistar. And again, maybe one to pick out here again, you see Vimoy looking in and around the other straight products, but there's the prothioconazole curve. So again, a straight, a nasal, really struggling, and that sort of poor slack curve there. Eradication, always that bit trickier. So you see those curves lift away from that nice tight corner. But again, the relative ranking there is the same. But you see how much more challenging eradication is compared to protection. And there's the yield. So just to sort of highlight there that, again, it's the Univoc that just pops slightly to the top there. It's rather faint, but there it is relative to the Revistar line. And again, you see what a straight prothioconazole is doing, and you see where Vimoy sits in and around the other straight leading products. And we've talked a lot about this decline in azole efficacy over the years. So while in the early 2000s we were looking at, 80% plus control from those products at full rate, you see it decline to barely 30 or 40% in latter years. We've recovered some of that with methane-trifluconazole, so that newer azole, but again, that's not bulletproof. And then when you start to look at the kind of erosion of efficacy, this is data produced by colleagues at Rothamsted. So what we want is isolates that sit at this end of the curve. So they're all controlled by quite low doses. So you see there where all the isolates were sitting for prothioconazole back in the early 2000s, and you see that drift. Now, the better news is that for 2003, we have no new outlier isolates, but you can see how we've lost all this sensitive part of the population and everything's bunching up here. Methane-trifluconazole, we're still getting good control and you don't see much drift between the years. But again, you begin to see that we've lost any of the isolates that sit at this kind of good end of the curve. And then getting on to the SDHIs. So you see the mixture products where in 2017, we're getting 80–90% control from Revastar, Ascra and Univoc. And you see those kind of famous toppling curves. So they begin to tip slightly. And we are beginning to build up those complex isolates with some level of insensitivity to SDHIs. So this is looking at bixafen as a kind of example SDHI, but they are all cross-resistant. So again, if you pick out the better news for 2003, the crosses there, we're getting no new outliers, so nothing out in this direction. But you can worryingly see there's a bunch of isolates now sitting at this kind of top end. And again, we're not getting any isolates down at this end. And again, in the Scottish trials, we were actually getting more isolates and the more complex isolates in the Scottish fungicide performance sites. So we are kind of nudging at the more complex and challenging isolates. Septoria is important to us, but it's not our only target. So yellow rust remains kind of in that basket of what you're considering in wheat early in the season. And again, you've got Revastar and Univoc sitting at this side of the chart. And again, that's, reasonable curves there for yellow rust. And you have your straight products here. And again, encouragingly, VMOI is looking quite good in and around the other SDHIs there. So, that's encouraging to get a spread of activity in a new active. Again, this is just pulling out the data from the 2022 season at full dose. So again, you see Revastar, Univoc, disease control there. There's the VMOI plus Proline. So very much in and around the other actives, there's VMOI on its own. So that gives you a relative ranking for that new introduction. And obviously, yellow rust can be fairly devastating to yield where it does get into trials. So here's the yield lifts that you get from that new chemistry. So again, we have sort of encouraging lifts there from some of those mixture and straight products. Brown rust clearly is still unusual in this neck of the woods, but there's always been that perception that prothioconazole has been weaker against brown rust. So again, VMOI brings quite good brown rust protection, so there's a kind of spread of efficacy there for you. And then fusarium, particularly in that wet summer, can be challenging. And traditionally, we've had prothioconazole as the main active there. Here you see Myrisas, so the straight methane-trifluconazole, also bringing some benefit there. So that's where your kind of ear sprays sit. That's not a particularly new or novel message to you. We're still very reliant on azoles to manage those diseases. So that's the wheat summary. I've picked out your key points there, so I will move into the kind of that caveat about how we steward and manage resistance going forward. We are concerned about some of these new Septoria isolates, so that message about mixing and using balanced mixtures of chemistry is really important, and that idea that we build resistance management into our programs going forward is absolutely critical. And it's all based, Neil and Henry will talk more about IPM going forward, but some of this is the real basic stuff about resistant varieties. And certainly we know that your early drilled wheat will be at higher risk and you might wish to target things slightly differently there. Reducing doses, using balanced mixtures are all kind of, I think, win-wins for you in terms of managing resistance and getting good margins on your wheat crops. And then thinking about the absolute basics of your program. So T1 will be driven by Septoria and your yellow rust input needs, and trying to take out those kind of marginal input sprays where the yield benefits are not as strong. So targeting T1 and T2 in particular with that really good chemistry. So then moving into the barley fungicides, And again, for this, it came up as a question there, wrinkle remains a kind of key target, both in your winter and your spring barleys. And just by way of contrast to your wheat curves, you can see here that the rhynchosporium curves are all that bit tighter. So we're in a good position when it comes to our barley chemistry. Here you're looking at protectant activity and eradicant activity. And again, the legends here are testing my memory, but you've got prothioconazole still behaving, in a fairly powerful way when it comes to your barley programs, slightly ahead of Myrica, the other azole. And again, you've got your mixture product. There's Ascra falling into this nice tight corner. A little bit more challenging eradicant wise, but largely the ranking is the same. And there's the over-year data. Again, very similar curves there. It maybe shows Myrica tailing the other products slightly in a more pronounced way. And again, the eradicant thing where things become that bit trickier comes through there. And there's the yield benefits to managing rhynchosporium in the fungicide trials. Net blotch, again, you see by contrast that the curve is lifting a bit from that corner, and we know we have underlying issues with SDHI, strobilurin, and to some extent azole chemistry. So there's a kind of powerful message there about using the mixture products. So you see, for example, Ascra looking well there where we've got that sort of balance of chemistry. And again, in an eradicant chart, over here, it becomes that bit more challenging, and it's the mixture products that come to the front because we're presumably managing some of those less sensitive isolates better. Ramularia clearly remains a sort of unknown quantity in our barley crops, and again, you see that where the proline leads for rhynchosporium, it's Myrica that comes to the front, so the methyltrifluconazole when it comes to ramularia management. Although, encouragingly, proline there is still, bringing a useful curve, and we were very concerned about resistance there a few years ago, so it's encouraging we still have that backdrop of management. Here we see in the over-year data a slightly broader spread of products. So you see Imtrex and Ascra there apparently bringing something to the ramularia party. And again, there's kind of a strong underlying problem with SDHI resistance in ramularia. I know Neil's very sceptical about whether this is truly ramularia management or just other greening benefits. But certainly, where we're never dealing with one target, again, there's probably benefits to the mixture chemistry at this timing. And there's the yield benefits from the ramularia management. So again, it is Myrica that pops slightly to the top there in the ramularia trials. And then I said I would come back to mildew. So we are reliant on the agrochemical companies for the monitoring data for the specific mildewicides. So we don't have information yet about whether there's anything about the specifics. We'll get that out to you as soon as we hear. But here's what you get from your established barley chemistry. So still the prothioconazole-based chemistry is bringing quite a lot in terms of mildew protection. Something there from Imtrex as well. And again, something from Revastar. So there's good protectant activity there, but it may well be challenging in areas where you have quite established mildew problems. So, again, around the Inverness area is historically very problematic for mildew. And there's the barley summary there. So I think I've made those kind of key points that we have good chemistry for our major diseases. The mixture story remains very important. And it's horses for courses as to which one you would pick. But mixture products giving you the broadest spectrum and the most robust control. So finishing with some slides on oilseed rape and light leaf spot management. So again, it's a disease that's historically worse in the northeast. It's driven by wet and warm summers, so we are in that pattern. And where we have quite a lot of light leaf spot over the summer, that increases your risk moving into the winter crops. I'm showing you the disease data from the ADAS High Mothorpe site for 2023. We have a second site at Bog Hall just outside Edinburgh where the disease was very established as we were putting on the autumn sprays last year. So we didn't get disease control, so the data's not being shown. And I'll talk a little bit about the yields that we got at that site as well. But anyway, the story from High Mothorpe, I think, is quite convincing. Again, there was some disease as we put on the autumn sprays, so that we were in a slightly curative situation, which is challenging for the fungicides. But what you see here is 3 of the prothioconazole-based products actually come to the front, and the 2 that are drifting there, again, you see the relative curves. These are quite straight, so you have Toledo as tebuconazole or the difenoconazole-based product, just sitting, ranking slightly behind the prothioconazole-based ones. And again, the yields, it's the 3 prothioconazole ones that lift to the top. The timing of the spray is always interesting and critical. So for last year, where the disease appeared early, what you see at the High Mothorpe site is that where we had, it was untreated in the autumn. This is the established disease in the autumn. So if I focus on the yield, where it was untreated in the autumn, there was very little in terms of yield benefit from a spring spray. And it's these 2 here where we had an autumn spray that the yield benefit has come through. And actually, if we look at the Scottish site, we get a similar story for last year. So we saw a yield benefit. The untreated, it was 3.7 tonnes a hectare, and we got up to 4.9 tonnes with the autumn sprayed prothioconazole treatments. And again, with no particular benefit to increasing from a half to a full rate. Now, obviously, with a challenging autumn, quite a lot of our oilseed rate remains unsprayed when it comes to light leaf spot. So we may well be looking at the activity that you get from your spring sprays next year. So it will be challenging. So just to finish with a quick summary there, you have both azole and non-azole options, and that is chemistry that you may well come back to when you're thinking about your sclerotinia sprays. So do try and think across your oilseed rate programme and mix and alternate when you come to those flowering sprays. So that while you may not be targeting light leaf spot with your flowering spray, it will be there in the crop and it will be part of what then moves into the following season. So that opportunity, if you can, to use alternative actives and to mix and alternate, I think, again, is a really key point. So just to leave you with a few of those take-home messages, great to have a new SDHI to talk about, but it is part of an established group of chemistries, so diversifying where we can is really key. And we are on the very limits of what we can manage in wheat. So that sensible and stewarded use of fungicides, not just the new one, but the old ones as well, is really vital to retaining them for the longer term. So we'll move into thinking about IPM, but using them in integrated programs really brings win-wins. Like I say, you get to sort of minimise and target and use appropriately and reduce your reliance on any individual actives. And that's really key to what we all do going forward. And I think that's where I would finish, Dave, if there's...
So obviously, they're quite been a difficult year, 2023. We've had, the market's come down so a huge amount. We've had the weather's been a real headache in the autumn, affected sowings and things like that. So really quite a tricky year, and there's lots of uncertainty in the world bubbling away. Now we're now in 2024. That's good news because you've got to start the year optimistic. Just whatever views you have of some of the events coming up, but. The key thing is I don't think 2024 will be a quiet year. If you sort of look at some of the things that are coming our way, whether it's elections, the US, the UK, you've got political characters around the world, these have all had an effect on the markets, on the economy and the grain prices. We've had that incredible amount of rainfall across not too far from here, but further south as well, and down in parts of England, which are going to have many repercussions. And some of those weather events are still playing out in other parts of the world. Yes, the market is down, but that fact, the bad news of increased production is factored into the price. So, we're still open to whatever may come next. Now, I think aside from, trying to understand the market, looking at the market, the most crucial thing really is to spend time on what is your, how are you going to approach the market? What is your strategy? So yeah, we've got 4 strategies here. If push comes to shove, if you had to pin your hand or pin yourself on one of these, which one would it be? So, number 1, wait till it's in the shed, okay? Get it harvested, then start selling it. If I haven't got it, I'm not selling it, right? That's strategy number 1. 2, just get it, go early in terms of selling, sell everything before harvest. How does that fit with you here? Another one, little and often, a third before harvest, and then sort of spread the other 2/3 out once you've got it in the shed. And then the more straightforward, 50% before, 50% after. So you've got those 4 options there. How do they fit with your own farming situation? If you can vote now. That's quite a surprise. So a quarter here are not selling until they've harvested it. That is, we only had 5% in Perth and 10% in the borders. So there's a bigger chunk up here just aren't selling it till you've got it in the shed. That's quite a big difference. It looks like somebody, or I think one person has said they will sell everything before harvest. We pretty well were 0 everywhere else, because obviously you've got the issue of the weather, quality and yield. So the big one here is a 50% selling a third before, 2/3 after. That's actually quite similar. We had a bit more actually doing that further south, but yeah, between those 2 strategies, 70%, you're selling some before, selling some afters, is quite reasonably similar to elsewhere, but a little bit being held back there. So yeah, so that's really good to see. We'll come back to these strategies and you'll see how they've worked according to how the market's moved for the different crops. So yeah, we're just going back on. I think we had more. There tend to be a bit more selling, forward selling in the borders and Perth. Right, okay, so what we've got covering now, so we've got, look at some of the current market situations. Why is the price where it is? What's important? What are some of the things we'll be looking out for in the year ahead? And then we'll have a wee look at the sales strategies and margins, how they've evolved over the last few years. Now, if we take a step back from grain and just look at the bigger economy, inflation's been a massive issue. So what we've got here is the oil price, the dotted line, and you've got the wheat price in green, and then blue is the consumer price index for the UK. So it goes up to the red line, and then we've got a forward projection or forward prices for that. So inflation's been massive. It was building a little bit before Ukraine in the post-pandemic, and then it went ballistic with the invasion, and oil prices really led that up. Grain prices went with them. Now, oil has come down a lot, but grain's come down a lot faster. And so, yeah, that easing of energy prices has fed through to lower inflation. So this is bad news, obviously, from the prices you've received. Clearly, things like fertilizer, fuel have come down massively. And for the economy, it is good news because whether it's the UK, America, other parts of the world, interest rates have been put up to try and calm inflation. That pressure is coming off. So hopefully we'll see interest rates coming down, and that will boost the economy, and that will have a benefit in certain markets for some of the end products that farmers are obviously ultimately producing. But short term, yeah, part of the deflation has come from the food prices. So, but what's really driven that drop in the grain price? Well, it's really just good weather and conditions, and coupled to those high prices. So, High prices have ultimately led to higher production by encouraging more production. The US, the biggest increase has been the maize crop, 58 million tonnes extra production from the big exporters led by the US. So an extra 43 million tonnes. They put more in the ground, they put more care and attention on it. The weather was good, they got another 43 million tonnes. Argentina, they had a drought in 2022. They got enough rain to pull in a better harvest this year. So they're up 20 million tonnes. Brazil, in this figure, is down 10 million tonnes. They've got a drought and it's affecting soy as well. But that is by far the biggest change in the world market, is that big corn increase. And it's pulled the maize price down. We've lost 75 pounds a tonne there. And, you know, corn here, you've got the feed grains, barley close to that, and then you've got the wheat and the other crops sitting above that. So it's really, you know, the fundamental reason there's been a big grain crop. And you've seen that come through. You've 55 pounds drop in the wheat price from a year ago, similar for feed barley. A bigger drop in the rape price, 120 pounds there. Malting barley, you know, round harvest was about 40 pounds. So that global thing is fed through. We've had lower prices here. What about wheat? Well, actually, production is actually down in the big exporters and for the crop itself. So 10 million tonnes less in those big exporters. Australia, they had much drier conditions. Canada's not had such a good harvest. Some increases elsewhere, but overall, it's lower. Russia has been creeping up in terms of exporting better crops at the moment, and they are pressuring our prices in this part of the world. So they're one of the ones that have contributed to lower prices. But overall, wheat is reduced. And when you put it all together, what does it say? If you put wheat, all the feed grains together, you get production and consumption. So production's actually now ahead of consumption, which is the first time for about 4 or 5 years. But still, despite that increase in 64 million tonnes, it's less than was projected. So the weather wasn't quite as kind as was first thought of back in May. And usage has gone up quite a lot as well. So 44 million tonnes of use. So stocks to use are still going down just okay. It's not a lot, about half a day of usage, but they are going a little bit lower. So yeah, we've got that news in the market. We've got those big crops. There's export competition, but fundamentally, the world has not rebuilt its stocks to a higher level than last year, and it remains open to the weather from here on. So yeah, not great news today, but I think we should be careful not to extrapolate that too far, because weather events will influence over the next few months, and it's already in the price. And yeah, if we just look at stocks to use, they have been low for feed grains. They're probably the highest in the last 5 years, but it's pretty small increase. And wheat have actually come down quite a lot, so it's the lowest in 9 years for wheat. So as I say, stocks to use are going actually still a bit lower for most of those grains. Now, what about oil? Now, there's been a huge shift in, will we see that inflation again? We've got the Houthis, we've got other people attacking and each other in the Middle East. Surely that's going to go up in flames at some point. Will that bump up the oil price? Possibly. So let's not get too carried away. But there's one big difference from, say, 2 years ago, is that America has been pumping, again, high oil prices. They've got record oil production. The biggest oil producer now in the world is America. New productions come on stream in South America. Guyana's got a huge new field. You've got Brazil. And OPEC are trying to squeeze the market and cut production, and it's not working because the Americans just keep pumping more. So that's quite a big shift, which for the time being suggests we won't get that cost squeeze that we had with the oil just recently. And if you look a little bit further ahead, we are potentially going to get to peak oil in the next demand in the next 5 to 10 years, given renewables, efficiencies, and other changes. So oil is less of a driving factor in the price at the moment. Now, what about biofuels? So they're important. They remain really important. Okay, they haven't grown hugely. The US is looking at a bit of an increase this year in corn for ethanol, and they've actually used a lot of biodiesel from soya. So oil is underpinning a lot of markets, but overall growth is not expected to be huge, and there's going to be more emphasis on sustainability. But it's still there. It's important in the UK. We've got significant usage here. But the other sort of longer term one is sustainable aviation fuel, because there is no other way of reducing the carbon emissions from jet fuel. And whether it's crops directly or other crops or residues for that energy, that is projected to grow massively. So, okay, not huge at the moment, but the growth is starting in that sector. So let's look at soya. It's had a probably greater price fall than the grains, driven by really strong production in South America. US has bumped up its production as well. So that's been the main thing that's driven prices down. There's a bit of a hiccup in Brazil at the moment. They've got some severe drought in parts of the province. They're having to re-drill a lot of soybeans. And I think the USDA they keep marking production down, but there's other estimates that are much lower. And so the next few weeks, if they don't get the rain they need, you'll see a permanent reduction from South America. And actually it's knocking on to maize, because if they don't get the the soy in early enough, then they can't put in the second crop of maize. So it's actually having a knock-on effect. And interestingly, if you start looking at the planting season, the US are expecting to grow more oilseeds because corn's not so profitable. But again, it depends on the weather. Do they get enough? Is the weather okay for corn, or do they get a wet spring, etc.? So that US planting season is going to be, again, an important driver. But if you look at rapeseed, exports have actually got a bit less. So competition's been a bit weaker for rapeseed, and rapeseed's driven to more of a premium over soybeans. And like for us, ourselves here in the UK, we're importing, we haven't got enough rape to meet the crushing. So whatever happens in Australia, which have got a lower crop, or Canada, these bigger export, Ukraine, they're ones that will affect our market here, as well as what's happening in South America. Now, this does look like good news. Fertilizer's down 50% a year. That's, again, linked to the energy. So that's good in terms of cost, but it does open the door a little bit more to production elsewhere because it lowers the cost of producing. Now, let's home into the UK. What's happening? Okay, this is AHDB. That's their early estimate of crop areas, and it was early December was the cut off of the survey. Farmers are asked, what are you intending? What have you planted? What are you intending to plant in 2023-24, or for 24 harvest? Now, clearly, there's going to be less wheat. So the figures at the moment, the best we have, say 3% less wheat and a bit less winter barley, and most of that switching into spring barley and oats. That seems, and rape's down as well, and more fallow. So that on its own, you'll see a bit later, will really factor a fairly big drop in the wheat production. But it's kept raining, it's probably stopped now, to be fair, but until very recently, it had just kept raining across a lot of these key areas. There's wheat that was planted went under, of course, even obviously in Angus, there's wheat that's had that effect. The seeds rotted in the ground. There's going to be a lot. There's have to be a choice is going to have to be made to re-drill it. So you could say, well, maybe that'll go into spring barley. In terms of malting, the key thing is the ground that's the heavy ground is not going to grow good malting barley. So the land that is going to have to be re-drilled is going to be a struggle to get decent malting barley out of it in the south. And of course, we've now got this SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive in England. £700 or £800 a hectare there for some of these birds, cover crop type mixes. It's awfully tempting if your ground's in a real mess in the spring, to just skip a harvest, take your payment, which is a big change that we've seen in those payments. So you could expect less wheat than is on here, and we may not see all that spring barley going back in. And even if we do, the chance of it being malting that's going to compete for malting markets up here is not looking that high. So I think as a local factor, that is going to be the biggest thing in the next year. What about Scotland? Similar picture, about sort of 8,000 hectares less wheat potentially, and most of that basically going into spring barley. Yeah, but that is quite a small change. But again, one of the biggest shifts in terms of local production. But we'll see how that pans out in terms of production just shortly. Again, similar issues, I think, certainly in some parts of Scotland. We've had people at meetings here, certainly in Perthshire, looking at re-drilling some of that crop, or Angus. So yeah, we'd probably expect that figure to be even less wheat and a bit more spring barley. Now, if we look at the whole supply and demand situation, this year the crop was actually a fair bit lower, just over 14 million. So that's 1.5 million tonnes less. Demand is good. We've got the biofuels, we've got good feed demand, but what we don't have is much export. We don't have a lot of grain for export. So when you work it through, we've probably only got 500,000 or so tonnes for export, and that's easily dealt with some biscuit wheat, etc., to some European markets. We do not need to export much wheat at all, which means, yes, the markets might be quiet, sluggish, things are not happening, but there's not enough sell. People won't have to sell because we don't need to shift that wheat. And because of what's happened, obviously, with the sowings, we're going to actually need to carry more wheat into next year, because next year, I'm probably being a bit optimistic there, saying 12 million tonnes. I've seen figures 10 or 11 potentially of production. So the UK is going to be a wheat importer next year. So the carry is pretty well there into new crop from May, June, through into harvest. You can pretty well carry wheat about £1.5 a tonne. Okay, interest rates are quite high, so you might want the cash. But the thing is, the market is basically wanting wheat to be held into next year. So that's good in terms of this year. We don't need to shift all that wheat, and we can ride out lower periods. Obviously, it's cash flow that will drive sales, but as a market, we don't actually need to send that wheat overseas this year. Right, 5 minutes, good. Maize, the crucial thing here in Scotland is, the demand for distilling is huge. Maize is our main competitor. Wheat has made a big difference in increasing the share of that, and we're now at a good premium to England, £12 a tonne. So the market's actually been competitive. Wheat has come down to keep in the game in terms of distilling, but it is a threat if the world maize price does come down further. This is the wheat crop. We've got potentially about 140,000 tonnes less wheat in the system next year, or this year coming, given those lower areas, and yields that no one's expecting to be fantastic, given such a poor establishment. So that obviously helps to maintain prices and premiums in Scotland. Let's look at malting. Malting's been a little bit higher this year. What about next year? If you factor the extra area in and those yields, we could have another 100,000 tonnes of malting barley. Again, a lot to play for in terms of quality and yields. Now, how does it affect the balance? So if we've got around 1 million tonnes of malting capacity in Scotland, if we do produce another 100,000 tonnes in 24, if you convert a share of that into malting barley, 1.2 million tonnes, then about 83% of that barley would need to be decent quality for malting. That is still relatively high share, and the higher that share is, the better the chance your premiums. And if you work those forward prices through, you're on about a £50 premium. So at the moment, ostensibly, yes, we'll have more barley, but how tight will it really be? And distilling, the forecast demands are still there. This is a slightly longer term, obviously going through to 2025. We've got another 140,000 tonnes of malting barley needed for distilling up to 2025, and similar for grain. So the underlying demand looks pretty good for whisky. Right, we better move just quickly to the final thing, looking at margins and strategies. So you'll not be surprised if you look at margins were good. In 2022, you had variable costs that were not so high, and you had those high prices. So you're looking at a significant rise in premiums, gross margins for both wheat and spring barley. And this year, high variable costs and lower output with the lower prices. We've had a big slump there in the gross margin. Let's try and turn that into actual sort of profit estimate, put in fixed costs. The 959 is the last figure we got from the survey of cereal farms in Scotland. I've put inflation on that. We know machinery, labour, etc. is going up. And you're really looking with either a very minimal, big, sort of just about break even or small loss on some of these crops based on very standard figures. Obviously, everyone's very different. And we still need that basic payment scheme for the average producer in a year like this. It just shows that it is important. Carbon is on the agenda, whether it's the governments or the distillers. That is going to be an increasing part of your market requirement. And just to say, just an example, we can turn it into an advantage. UK wheat, 432 kilos per tonne of wheat. French maize, 465. Brazilian maize, over 1,000. So, that may not affect the whisky industry directly, but it just shows you if we can work on improving our sustainability, then, whether it's the government or the industry in terms of distilling, there's a demand for that. Now, let's look at the strategies. How do they work? So the blue are those who waited till harvest. So if you look at anything, if you wait until the harvest, you will get the highest average price. You will do the best in the long run. The issue is cash flow, because you'll also get the lowest price, obviously, in a year perhaps like this, at this stage so far. So the other strategies are somewhere in between. And selling a share of it forward certainly does even out those peaks and troughs. Now, I know that the figures are going, or they are on the website, so you might, I know we're short of time, so you can look a wee bit more closely, but you will see, wait until harvest, you will get the highest price in the long run, but you will suffer in years like this. So pick a strategy that suits you best. Now, I put some estimates, some values for looking forward. Actually, the futures prices for wheat are actually higher for a new crop, and you can base malting barley on top of that. The oilseed rape prices are higher for a new harvest, so that's quite positive. Distilling, the barley would be a little less given where it was this year. So that looks good, but if you look at cost of production, they're actually higher too, and it's not amazingly attractive on average costs, but of course you'll have your own costs to look at. But I think ultimately you've got to have a strategy in terms of how much to take now, how much to wait. So I think given the time, I would just like to summarize, the market is where it is today. It's all factored into the price. It is a bit gloomy right now, but keep looking ahead. There are opportunities. Forward prices are a bit higher. There are events yet to unfold, and there'll be plenty of them in the next few months. We know that. And things have not got worse in terms of the world. We do not have higher stocks. And locally, it's looking particularly tight into next year because we just haven't got that crop in the ground. So, there are some indications there that, if there are things get worse in terms of the weather around the world, that the market will respond. We have got carbon as increasingly important, and we've got to pay that, whether it's the market or subsidies, we've got to pay attention to that. And putting aside all the information about the market, what is the most critical thing is to have, what is your marketing strategy? Decide what that is. Everyone came clearly out with one, so that's great news. The hard thing is, write it down and stick it to a wall, because I was going to say stick to it, but that is, it's human nature and all the rest of it. But I think to have a note, this is what we're doing, let's pin it on the wall, let's keep an eye on it through the season. It gives you, coupled to an estimate of what your costs are going to be, it gives you an indicator to maybe put the noise of the market to one side, just say, okay, have we got to sell some now to cover our budget? Can we wait? Then you're a bit more in control rather than just sort of waiting on events. So that's really the key areas we're going to cover today. Thank you.
What I'd like to do for you this morning is to focus on the new Scottish SRUC list, and then try to draw on what Paul has presented and kind of flag up some of the most important developments across the different crop species. So this is the outline of the presentation. So the main part will be running through the different crop species and really kind of indicating what's new and indicate why we've chosen the particular varieties that are new onto the list. I'll just start with a bit of a review of last harvest and just put that into context of the long-term trends across the different cereals. A very useful website to look at is the Scottish Government's webpage, where you can actually review the yields over many years, areas and productions for our major crop species. And this is a far more interactive website now, so I'd urge you to look at that. And you can position your own farm, your own trends on that basis. And the following slides will kind of flag this up for you. So just on last harvest, in terms of the areas of the crops, barley, oilseed rape up on the previous year, wheat about the same as the previous year. Although yields were down last harvest compared to the year before, don't forget that harvest 22 was a very high yielding year. So overall we didn't do too badly in what was a very challenging harvest and often growing conditions through spring into summer last year. These good yields meant that in terms of total cereal production, we were just above the 10-year mean. So we were above 3 million tonnes in terms of all of the cereals, which is a healthy number, and it's an indication that we're meeting the needs of our main cereal end uses. Oilseed rape production was actually the highest it's been for 20 years, so a particularly healthy crop last year. So as I say, particularly challenging conditions last year, and I think to some extent we're seeing the benefit of some of the new varieties, and we're making the choices now for the most resilient and the most robust varieties, particularly crops such as the winter barley with the newer high-yielding two-row varieties doing particularly well across a range of different growing conditions, even in challenging years. So as I say, I'll quickly whiz through these figures here on various measures of production, and just for you to take these away and compare with your own production on farm. So this is the total cereal production. So as you can see here, what I was saying here, last year it developed this familiar pattern now where we are achieving above 3 million tonnes across all of the cereals. In terms of spring barley, so the top left here shows the area, which fluctuates around the 250,000 hectares. Last harvest, we were just about spot on for that long-term average. And you can see from the yields, we were slightly down last year compared to the some of the previous years, but still relatively good considering the conditions that we faced. Okay, so well above 6 tonnes per hectare, and these yields were relatively good compared to crops in many parts of England. So you can see production was close to 1.6 million tonnes, which is really where we should be aiming for, and to achieve at least that for our most important malting barley sector. Winter barley, well, we know we've got this over many years, this downward trend in yield, and achieving production that's close to 0.4 million tonnes, we do need to utilise the new varieties and take advantage of the higher yielding varieties to get close to that particular figure. So you can see yield generally going up, areas over time has come down. But as I say, we do need to benefit from the high yielding 2 rows as well as the hybrids to get close to that 0.4 million tonnes production. Wheat had a relatively good year, particularly compared to its English counterpart. So area 107,000 tonnes. Yield was pretty good in a difficult year. Again, some evidence that we are benefiting from some of the newer high yielding varieties and production good, close to that 1 million tonnes. And then just finishing with oats, sometimes we get some big swings with oats in terms of yield, but compared to previous years, area slightly down last year and the year before. Yield pretty healthy, and production perhaps just a little bit down on the recent years. But again, with newer, higher yielding varieties, I think we've got an opportunity to really benefit from yield and quality in this particular crop. So just on to the main part of the presentation now. So I'll start with spring barley, and you'll see the familiar tables. So these are taken from the new Scottish recommended list. The actual the projection here is not shown the colour coding so well, but what you'll see here is the main malting options available to us. And the first look, you see, it's quite a long list when you consider how conservative this sector is. Now at the bottom, we've got perhaps the top 4 in terms of the main intake for the different uses. So Laureate, of course, dominates, supported by Diablo and Sassy for malting, for distilling, and then Fairing for grain distilling. But I'd also like to flag up Firefox, that's got full approval for milk distilling. And just bear in mind that the question that we had about maturity, Firefox is relatively early maturing, and it's also relatively good in terms of resistance to grain skinning. So I would like to see this variety be given a chance to see how it fares in different parts of the country, particularly with its quality and its maturity. The other varieties there, you can see from the second column there, the year on the recommended list. So Diviner and Tennyson in year 2 now. And these 2 varieties both look encouraging for their target markets. So Diviner for malt distilling has achieved particularly good extract and predicted spirit yield for that sector. Likewise, Tennyson has also got high extracts, very good predicted spirit yield, and another feature called good beta-glucan removal, which is important for brewing. So SY Tennyson could well suit both brewing and milk distilling. And the qualities of these are certainly we regard as being above that of the current controls. The varieties at P1 here, so first year on the list, I think we can think of these about the continued pipeline with potential support to the current market leaders. So it's good to have more choice, more varieties coming through, just in case we do pick up weaknesses in any of the established varieties or the other relatively new varieties. So there's some way to go for Belter, Monroe and Olsen, but I would say at the moment Olsen's probably got the better quality in terms of its potential end uses. It could suit both malt distilling and brewing. So the status of the varieties for the different markets are shown in the distilling, brewing and grain distilling columns. Other varieties here, so these are other brewing varieties that could be used for feed, and the bottom two out and out feed barleys as well. So just conscious of time, but I'll just indicate here that we've got a range of established varieties and also newer varieties such as SY Signet and the very new Bounty that are taking yield in trials forward. And again, you can see the position of these varieties in the testing system overseen by the Malting Barley Committee. Just on the agronomics, going back to the malting varieties here, you can see that there's a range in features here in terms of the qualities. And again, this projection doesn't show my colours, green, yellow, white, orange and red. So do look at the proper recommended list so you can see varieties that we're suggesting are good, towards good in terms of their traits, towards poor or poor. Just flagging up again on the maturity, you can see the range of maturities there across this particular group of varieties. Straw strength overall is pretty good, some variation in specific weight. Just on other aspects of agronomics, across the same varieties, Brackling resistance remains very strong. The disease to really think about here is Rhynchosporium. Okay, so some variation across these varieties in resistance to this particular disease. Just on the other brewing and feed varieties, again some variation in maturity, specific weight here, straw strength pretty good overall. Overall, again, screenings tend to be towards good or good for these particular varieties. And then just finishing here with the same varieties, Brackling resistance very good, and again some variation in the in Rhynchosporium across these particular choices. So just on to spring oats and then spring wheat. So this is a more consolidated list for spring oats, and the main thing to flag up here is that we're bringing together yield and good grain quality. So speak with your end user here about the preferred varieties. Certainly the market leaders have been Canyon, Conway and Merlin. Isabel there, a little bit behind in terms of market share, but that particular variety does have a really nice combination of grain quality characteristics. Just a little bit more on agronomics, some variation in maturity there, generally relatively good in straw strength. Okay, crown rust, we know that that's a weakness in this particular crop, so that they're all kind of tending to be poor or towards poor. Winter wheat is quite a long list for a crop that's has a relatively small area grown, but we've included on this list varieties from the different UK FM groups. So from the quality milling wheats and the out-and-out feed varieties. And you can see from this particular table that we've got some nice combination of high yield and also some very good grain qualities as well, particularly Hagberg falling number, specific weight, and good protein content. So there's quite a big choice for what is actually quite a small area for this crop. But do see what's available and take advantage of these varieties if you want a different spring crop to be sown. Just finishing with the agronomics here. generally pretty good in terms of maturity. Nothing is extraordinarily late, and overall straw stiffness tends to be good in these particular choices. Okay, so coming on to winter barley now. So it's two-row feed barley, and as I alluded to at the beginning, we're really starting to see the benefit now of some higher yields in the varieties that we are selecting and growing. And we can see that now we've got Mountain, that we were impressed with its yield and high specific weight when it came on the list a few years ago. And now we can see that newer varieties such as Caravel and Capital, we can compare the yield against Mountain now. Overall, across these varieties, specific weight is maintained. It's very good. There's some variation in the untreated yield. So here indicated in the yield loss if untreated. Take advantage of that with some of the better untreated yields, because we do know that disease resistance is not as good as we hope it will become in this particular crop. Going back to Paul's point about preferred traits in varieties, we do need to see some improvement, particularly in winter barley and winter wheat. I've just put this extract up here because we've got the crop response to soil type as well. So do look at the data where we've got a response to the lighter textured and the heavier textured soils across these varieties. So we'll say a lot more about these varieties when we go through events in the summertime. Just completing winter barley, here we've got two malting varieties at the top. We've got Cadospheris, which is the only conventional 6-row, but this is a BYDV tolerant variety, and the main part of the table are the high yielding hybrid varieties. Okay, so this is our current selection. Very high yields generally and very good specific weights. The gap between the 2 rows and the 6-row hybrids is closer than it has been. Okay, but the hybrids still have the edge when it comes to the very highest yielding crops. But bear in mind that this can put pressure on stem strength, okay, and some of these varieties can be quite weak for that feature. Just wanted to say something about specific weight. So this is specific weight. Thanks, Chairman. So this is specific weight in spring barley compared to screenings, and just look at this image, and there's evidence that we can take advantage of both having low screenings and high specific weight in this particular crop. So look out for that kind of trend, and I hope that can persist, particularly in higher yielding varieties. Winter barley, the main message from this particular slide is that the specific weight is going in the right direction, so it's towards that end. So all varieties are pretty good, apart from 1 or 2 outliers which aren't actually on the recommended list. So encouragement there in terms of developments in specific weight and other features, particularly screenings. And then in spring barley, there's some evidence that high specific weight is perhaps in some of the lower yielding varieties. Okay, so we do want perhaps to try to bring specific weight, low screenings and high yield together. So that most of the varieties, our preferred ones, are in the middle of that pack on the left-hand side. And as you can see from winter barley, there's no clear relationship between these two measures. The encouraging sign is that specific weight is towards the right-hand side. So just finishing now, winter wheat. So these are the soft wheats, group 4s and group 3s. So the top section there, it includes our leading varieties now in the soft feed for distilling, and you'll notice relatively new varieties here at Zealand and the very new Blackstone. So look out for these varieties and compare them against our current standards, including LG Skyscraper. The bottom three, these are Group 3 varieties and include the new Bamford. So all of these have some value also for distilling, so they all suit distilling. We've lost some of the weaker varieties now, like Saki now and Barrel, which of course didn't suit grain distilling. Just finishing then on the hard wheats. So the upper part of this figure here has got the feed options. So you can see we've got some varieties there, Dorsum and Typhoon, with a relatively good untreated yield. So we'd like to see some of the soft textured varieties develop in that direction as well. So we've got some very high yields among these choices, including the new LG Beowulf as well. So we hope that bracketed 107 is realised and is sustained in future. The bottom three are Group 2 varieties, which are our preferred choices from that section. Very good untreated yields and have been performed relatively well, particularly in the south of the country. So X-days, perhaps we flag a bit of warning if that variety is exposed to frost conditions, and perhaps this far north it can have a seed set issue. Just finishing then, specific weight and yield here. Look at this afterwards in a little bit more detail. It just shows there's variation among the different quality groups, and the encouragement is we're moving in the right direction with the new varieties to the top right for yield and specific weight. And finally, just thinking back to Paul's presentation and where we might go in terms of agronomic value in the future. Where we want to be in this particular chart, so we've got treated yield at the bottom there, untreated yield on the left-hand side. We want to be to the right and then the upper portion of this particular table. So we don't want to have these weaker varieties that suddenly drop their yield in the untreated situation. And it's encouraging that lots of the newer varieties, including the soft ones, are moving upwards and to the right in this particular trend. So I think I'll just leave you there with these take-home messages. Certainly we've, crops like wheat, we've removed older varieties, outclass varieties, so focusing on varieties that are going to have, we hope, value for several years to come. Spring barley is very much about investing in the future with some new additions to the table. Winter barley remains a very strong list, and I think we are seeing evidence for improved yields on farm reflected in the national statistics. Here are some links for you to look at afterwards.
I've been asked to talk a little bit about, Adrian's asked me to talk a little bit about the strategic farms that we run. So this is part of the, like a sister network really to the monitor farm. So just thought I'd ask, but show of hands, has anybody heard of the strategic farm network? A couple of hands? Oh, that's good. That's better than expected. Okay, yeah. Because I think one of the things that we haven't done very well with this network is actually talk about it. And it's a really interesting network, I think, with some really cool trials that are going on. And it's sort of halfway house between some of the more academic stuff that we've done today and the monitor farm stuff that we normally do, which is focused around sort of discussion and all that sort of stuff. So we've got some facts about the strategic farms there. So they're longer commitments than the monitor farms. You guys, your monitor farms up here are 4 years rather than 3 years down in England. These are 6-year commitments that these host farmers sign up to work with us. They're a much higher research budget. So the idea of these strategic farms is that they are research into practice in a commercial situation. So we're trying out some of the stuff that we've heard this morning, and we're putting it into sort of field scale, stuff on a proper commercial farm to see how that research really plays out over long periods of time. So hopefully that's a really useful thing to be doing. I think, yeah, they're really interesting because we've got a really good sort of split geography of them as well. So on this map that does come out, you can see the orange markers of the strategic farms. So as Dave said, your local one would be David Aglin up in Fife, but we've also got David Blacker down near me in Yorkshire. Over in the east, we've got David Jones at the Morley Agriculture Foundation and in Norfolk, and we've got David Miller down in Hampshire. At the moment, one of the qualifiers to be a strategic farmer is you have to be called David. It'd be nice to change that in the future for no reason other than it's a bit strange. So they've got a really good geographical spread, so we can try out some of these big research ideas, you know, nitrogen use efficiency, you know, IPM programs, all that stuff, as well along this sort of, you know, really nice geographical spread, and hopefully 2 and 2 becomes 5 as we start to learn more and more from one another. So there's the 4 Davids, the group of the Davids there. David Aglin is actually our longest serving strategic farmer at the moment, apart from Brian Barker, who's just finished and ruined the trend with being a Brian. And then they're sort of sequentially sort of moving down the years, if you see what I mean. So it's like a rolling program, just like the Monitor Farm Network. And I suppose I should say at this point that all of the trials that we do on these farms are directed by the host farmer and a steering group. So the idea is that they are, you know, they're thought up by the farm network, and then we work with SRUC, with NIABS, with ADAS, to then design trials around what the farm group and the steering group that the host farmer sort of picks for their interest areas. So we've got, you know, a really wide range. However, they do sort of fit in some, you know, similar broad categories. So I'm not going to go through all of these because we've got some examples going along, but these are all the areas that were investigated last year. But there's some broad stuff around nutrition, around IPM, around making decisions better, and they sort of share some different things across these. So that's the idea of what we're going to go through today. We've got some sort of broad topic areas, and I'm going to just go through some of the high-level results because this is a program that's been going for 7-8 years in total. So can't go through all the results in sort of 20 minutes, but we'll do some just high-level stuff that we learned from last year as we start to sort of generate lots and lots of results from this network. So the first one is around measuring and monitoring. So this was one of the themes for the results webinars that have just gone by in November that I'll mention at the end. We've got Strategic Farm Scotland looking at nitrogen, so measuring and monitoring, making decisions. Strategic Farm South, we've got soil health. And then at North, with David Blacker, we've got masses and masses of historical yield data and lots of soil data and all that kind of stuff there. So it made sense to sort of go back through that and see if we could use any of that better than we do now. So these are some of the high-level results. Steve has gone, he might disagree. But one of the things from David Aglin in Fife, that point 1 there, is what we've been doing there is having a look at how we can make better in-season nitrogen use decisions. So, you know, how we can make decisions as we go along through the season to adjust the nitrogen program, to adjust it to the season that's happening. We've been using bricks, SPAD, SAP analysis, tissue analysis, drone imagery with the partners at SRUC to try and work out which of those techniques gives us the best information to make those decisions as we go along the season. And I think what we've learned so far is probably that some of those, you know, in-field techniques like bricks and SPAD analysis are really, really tricky to get right and really, really tricky to interpret the results. That's the really tricky bit. There's Steve. Just give me a thumbs up at the back. And actually the stuff that we know more about, that drone imagery, that NDVI, that's providing us with better guides of where we can sort of adjust the nitrogen management in the season because we can interpret it a little bit better. One of the challenges with bricks and stuff, Steve, wasn't it, at the beginning, was that we couldn't get the results back quickly enough to then make a meaningful decision because, you know, a week or so in terms of bricks and in terms of SPAD, in terms of chlorophyll is a really long time depending on what the weather does. The second really interesting bit that I think, and a couple of the strategic farmers are looking at this, is yield map data and how to make better use of yield map data. So we know that it's probably a really underutilised resource. I don't know about you, but when I was doing agronomy, you know, there were nice pictures that I looked at and it sort of aligned with things that I already knew about fields in my head in terms of higher yielding and low yielding areas. But beyond that, I didn't really ever do anything with them. So that map that you can see at the bottom there is a yield stability map. So this is something the NIAB have come up with, but we've been doing it on all the strategic farms as well. So that's not 1 year of yield data, that's layers and layers of yield data, you know, up to sort of 15 years at that site at Strategic Farm East. And you can see the darker colours are the higher yielding areas through all of those seasons, and it starts to match up with things like soil type. It's really obvious, isn't it, when you think about it? But you know, doing the data analysis and going back through it is really, really useful to try and sort of build this and understand how we can use yield map data a little bit better to start guiding decision making. So NIAB used that to then put their trials in fields and not put them over sort of rubbish bits of fields and good bits of fields so that they can do really good trials. But for us, we can then start to use that to think about variable rate management and how we split fields up and things like that, which is really, really useful. That obviously takes a ridiculous amount of processing and computer work and isn't sort of viable to be able to do through things like Gatekeeper. But a really interesting thing that Susie Rokes at ADAS pointed out, which is point 3 on there, eyeballing yield maps matches up with this. So if you sit in the farm office and you get the last 5 years of yield maps, generally if you look and you use a bit of logic of where you know the fields are good, fields are bad, soil types change, you can do this process just by eyeballing, and you can nearly get to the same thing that we did with this quite expensive number crunching that we did across lots of other yield maps. So it's a really achievable thing to be able to do in farm. The second area that I was going to have a quick talk about was IPM, and we've just talked about IPM, and I'm very much using that broad definition that we've just had questions of IPM in the room. When I started doing agronomy, that definitely meant counting aphids on plants and thresholds, and now I'm thinking about that in terms of disease and nutrition and all that other stuff that comes into IPM as we use that bigger sort of definition. Strategic Farm East that's just finished, we had masses of IPM work there, which I'll go through and I'll touch on, and we've also got some sort of cover crops and water quality and sort of baselining of crop and soil performance as well. This is mainly based on the Barkers. The Barkers are based down in East Anglia, in Suffolk. So if you think about the disease profile down there, if we get through the Septoria periods, really we're just worrying about late rust. It's quite a low disease pressure site. So in hindsight, this was probably not the most useful trial to do in that region because actually we had really low disease pressure for the entire 5 years that we ran this piece of work. But we did learn really interesting things, even against that quite low disease backdrop. So the main thing was that we learned that compared to a standard program, there was quite a lot of wiggle room that we could moderate that fungicide use in particular to lower that fungicide use based on what we were seeing in the season. So the graph that you can see there is a gross margin graph, sort of positive and negative along that axis in the middle. And this side towards me is high programs, T1, T2, T3, very high. Right down the bottom is sort of, just T1, T2, very, very low inputs. And you can see it's a sort of gross margin graph. We did this season by season. And sort of picking up on what Fiona said and what others have said, by using sort of elements of that IPMs in terms of genetics, choosing suitable varieties, moderating the drilling date to suit the conditions down there, and also considering the economics of then what we spent and how we spent it to make sure that we had a return, we found that we could really moderate that fungicide use. So that's really, really useful. Potentially less useful for you guys up here, but we are replicating this in Yorkshire and in higher disease regions, and we could do it at David Aglin's as well. Potentially it could be something that we could look at in the future to sort of test this idea in a higher disease pressure setting, which would be really, really cool. The second bit was flower margins. So I think we're going to hear quite a lot more of this afternoon about IPM and flower margins and that sort of stuff. So the Barkers, particularly Patrick Barker, one of the brothers, has a really, really strong interest in all of this stuff. And we had some really, really nice biodiversity results. We put flower margins in different parts of the farm and next to different kinds of habitats to see what would happen. And really what we learned was that they have a really positive impact on biodiversity. If you stick them next to a habitat that already exists, like a woodland or a really good hedgerow or something, then you get even better biodiversity. And when we stuck them in the middle of fields, it annoyed the operators and we didn't get such a good uplift in biodiversity. So we measured how far things were moving out into the crop and all that sort of stuff. So that seemed, at least initially at the beginning, placing them next to those existing habitats was really important. Next up, we've got cover crops. So unsurprisingly, that's a theme that we see through all of the strategic farms pretty much. So in the finishing strategic farm of the East, we have cover crops and particular focus on water. David Aglin in Fife has a particular focus on destroying the cover crops and then getting spring barley crop established because that was his main question. And then in the South, we've got David Miller, who's been using cover crops for well over a decade to try and improve his soil because he doesn't like things with 4 legs and wool. And has done so quite spectacularly, really, as you can see by this picture. So I suppose the message from across the network, and it's, we all know this probably, is that cover crops can provide benefits to soil health and biodiversity. They do a good job. And generally, where we're stewarding them well, and the farmers learnt to sort of grow them well in their system, they're not compromising that cash crop productivity, which is fantastic. And you can see those 2 pictures. The one on the left is David Miller, so you can see that's a thin, chalky soil. These are from Hampshire. Near where I grew up on the South Downs. That one is a brand new field to David, soil looking pretty challenging and quite tight. Over there is one of his fields that he's managed for over a decade in this sort of, zero tillage, high cover cropping, really wide rotation style that he's got down there. And you can see, can't see very well from the overhead projector, but there's so much more bioporosity in there. There's loads of roots all the way through. So it's really nice to see that that's possible, especially for some of those farmers that really don't want four-legged friends on the farm. We had two strategic farms look over periods of sort of 3 to 5 years at reducing nitrate leaching with cover crops. And again, the big message there is that that's absolutely possible. You know, it makes logical sense, doesn't it? By covering the soil in the winter, by having something growing, and by having a load of roots in there, we're having that metric of slowing down water. In the profile, we've got lots of roots. It's taking some of that nitrate up. Fantastic. And we worked with South East Water and whoever supplied the water in East Anglia, I don't know off the top of my head, Anglian Water, maybe, to measure the drainage water afterwards, send them off to the lab, look at the nitrates, and it works really, really well. You know, both clearing up the sediment in the water and clearing up the nitrate in the water. So really useful tool that we've seen at a few sites from those, and we've seen it over those repeated years. Lastly, perhaps most pertinent to you guys in the room, David Aglin's, the theme that we've got from there really is early and early. So establishing cover crops early and then destroying them early when we're thinking in a spring cropping situation is the message over and over again. That works best for the cash crop. For the biodiversity, having those cover crops a little bit longer and actually drilling the spring barley into the cover crops works the best, but that then provides us with the most challenging conditions for establishing and having a good catch crop getting away. And we've seen that year on year on year, and actually it's got to the point where we're not learning anything more, so we're going to change that trial because we know that it's going to give us a really bad cash crop each time. So that he's actually going to switch in sheep this time and have a look at sheep grazing and how that has an impact alongside Lorna Cole, who we hear from later, who's going to sort of look at the biodiversity benefits and all that other stuff from there. So really interesting trials. A couple of graphs that I don't know about there because these are Henny's slides, so we'll move on. Last but not least is nutrient use efficiency. So I say nutrient use efficiency on purpose because I'd like to look at outside nitrogen and sort of consider other nutrients in this, but at the moment most of these trials are focused on nitrogen. So at Scotland we've got foliar and conventional, sort of managed by Steve and Fiona. In the south we've got a really interesting sort of question about nutritional quality of grain and how we manipulate that with nitrogen. And then over in the north, we've got a really cool project with drainage, you know, oft forgotten thing that we don't think about anymore and we just, you know, jet out if we desperately need to, but nobody's actually putting fresh drainage in. So we've got a really interesting trial on that. So with nutrient use efficiency, again, I think, you know, Steve might give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down from the back, but actually it seems the trend is from across those farms is using simple measures to understand how nitrogen is varying on the farm is a massive step up from not doing anything at all. So whatever we're doing to start working out that NUE balancing calculation of what's coming in, what's going out, what's ending up in the crop, and how we can manipulate that system seems to be a really, really good thing. And across the strategic farms, we then see our nitrogen use efficiency improving, and we're able to spend a bit less, we're able to tailor some of that agronomy. So that seems to be a really good trend that we're focusing on across the farms. You can see one of the strategic farm Scotland strip trials across the top there with different types of agronomy. What we saw interesting was Strategic Farm South. So I mentioned David Miller has been doing this probably no-till for over a decade, really wide rotation, lots and lots of different crops, using organic covers instead of organic manures because he doesn't have access to organic manures, but there's lots and lots of root and biomass going into that soil for, you know, over a decade. And what he wanted to have a look at was whether any of those biological products, some of the ones that were just mentioned alongside things like molasses and eco-worm and all of these sort of products that are supposed to help early establishment, whether they could have a positive effect on the establishment of winter wheat. And the answer seemed to be, over the 4 years, if you have really, really good soils, like David does, because he's done those big jobs of looking after it, and he's been really, really patient with that, we saw absolutely no significant difference from any of those you know, products that we put on that are marketed to sort of do that early establishment stuff. And we think that really is because his soils are really, really good. He takes care of them, he's got a wide rotation, he's doing all those basic farming things really, really well. And actually spending a few quid on a can doesn't make any difference in that situation. Not to say in a really degraded soil, it might not do a really good job and that might be the place for those products, but it's just one site, one farm, but it seemed that we're not getting a very good benefit there. So we've actually scrapped it again. We've done 3 or 4 years. This is the nice thing about having these for 6 years. We can learn something, make a decision halfway through and change. So actually what we're looking at instead now is companion cropping and how that will benefit for the next season. And the last project that I'm going to talk about is David Blacker in Yorkshire, and he's got a drainage project. I did my PhD on drainage and subsoil compaction, so I think this is really exciting. Because nobody talks about drainage anymore, nobody's excited about it, but that's a field that you can see at the bottom there. And the different colours and the different widths, he's got his own drainage machinery, so he's installed different drains at different widths all over the field, and we've got some sampling points in the outlets. We've also got a non-drained area, and we've got some really old drains at the top as well. And what it allows us to do, I suppose David's question is, all of the drainage guidance is from 1970-something. Is it relevant to how we're putting in drainage now? And is, for different soil types, would it be better to sort of vary the spacing of that drainage and how it's put in? Because he thinks the standard guidance on his ridiculously heavy sort of Yorkshire, it's the flat plain, it's the Yorkshire plain. So it's really, really heavy soil. It probably should just be a floodplain for the river. Is there a better way of putting in that drainage for his soil? So obviously this is a very long project, and he only put in the drainage last year, so we've got the first year of results, but really that land is recovering from the drainage installation at the moment, which you obviously can see would have been quite intense. But even in the first year, compared to the no drain bit and compared to the old drainage, putting in that fresh drainage, getting some more water away, had a positive impact on yield, a significant positive uplift on yield. So we're already seeing some of those results, and we're going to keep going with that, look at the nitrogen use efficiency, look at everything else in the establishment, the weed pressure. And to be honest, the main limiting factor for this field and quite a few fields on the farm is that crops fail frequently. So if you look across a rotation, that's one of the main sort of economic limiting factors that we've got at that farm. So hopefully that will provide some really interesting data. There's one of his yield maps. As I said, we've just had our first ever strategic farm leave, complete his tenure, and we've handed over to a new strategic farm. So that says what have we learnt from the strategic farm network, but actually this should say what has Brian Barker really learnt from the strategic farm network, because these are sort of comments from him. The first thing that he said that was positive was that the strategic farm network, I think because of the tenure of it, gave him sort of engagement with the wider farming community. People could come for those 6-year periods and sort of really get to know the farm. Those two are really, really good on Twitter, and they got a really big following of people who were following along with some of the trials that they were doing. And the luxury of sort of having a higher research budget means we can do some quite ambitious trials with NIAB in this site and ADAS earlier on. Two of the things that I completely agree with that we need to improve on was that the monitor farm network and the strategic farm network don't really talk to one another, and only about a quarter of the people put their hand up in this room about sort of knowing the strategic farm network, so I think that's definitely something we need to improve on, all talking to one another and learning from one another rather than just having these sites in silos. So that's something that I'm concentrating on at the moment, is trying to put them together more. And also, I think just this is his comment in general about the industry, is collaborating using on-farm experience. Research is valuing on-farm experience and on-farm knowledge. But this is exactly where strategic farms are supposed to operate, in this sort of messy middle ground between real academic trials that are small plot trials and what we do on farm. So, plans going forward. We've got 2 touch points a year, so that I suppose David Aglen might be a little way for some of you guys, but we have summer open days. And these are points where we have, for you guys, for David Aglen, we'll have SRUC there. We'll have various points around the farm where you can go out and you'll go on a farm tour and you can hear from the academics actually in the field, look at what we're doing, ask questions. The idea is that it's small groups and it's interactive and we can ask questions. So hopefully that'll be really good. If you're not able to attend any of those, we have results webinars in the winter. I'm not convinced this is the best way to sort of tell people about it, is sitting down in November and sort of listening for an hour and a half on a results webinar. So I'm open to ideas of how we could do that a little bit better. But there is that provision as well, that you can sit and really listen to the in-depth results about how that works. And I've been then writing those up into posts and blog posts and things. So hopefully those are a bit more digestible if, lots of graphs isn't your bag. We're also going to have a strategic farm conference at some point this year. So again, just focusing on the trials in a little bit more detail. And also that's Brian Barker there from Suffolk, have his final report. So we're going to tie those together. Plan for this year. The luxury, I suppose, this slide might be a bit disappointing, because the luxury of the strategic farm network is we can do the same thing over and over again. So especially with nitrogen research and stuff like that, and some of the IPM stuff, and some of the stuff that Lorna's going to talk about later that she's repeating, beginning, middle and end for David Aglen, is that we were studying those over longer periods of time. So we're not changing the trials every year. So actually for Scotland, South and North, this looks quite similar every year, but that's intentional. We're hoping to build those big data sets so we can actually learn something that's really valuable. The new one this year is, as I mentioned, Brian Barker's gone. David Jones, because he had the right name, has come in from TMAF, and the things that he's concentrating on this year is cultural weed control. So we've got a partnership with Garford, and they're the ones who do the sort of the inter-row hose with the cameras, and he's also got one of those weed surfers, which is sort of like this medieval torture implement, like a topper that's inverted and spins off, because he's got some problems with resistant ryegrass. But the same would be true, these techniques would be true of any sort of, grass weed issue that anybody has. The other question he's got is around IPM, particularly focusing on BYDV, but the principles could be applied to anything with IPM, is using those digital decision support tools and how we can actually use those better. We've got TSUM for IPM, but it's a pretty basic tool, and it definitely could be better in terms of how it applies to different, different regions and different cropping situations. So Acrobat, the new one that was developed in a partnership with ADAS, we're going to be testing that out and sort of measuring, what would be good and what would be bad from those different things. But also looking at some of those resistant varieties, and I've forgotten the name of the resistant variety, resistant wheat variety, BYDV. Wolverine, yeah. So we've got some of that in as well. So we'll be comparing across those and seeing how the BYDV develops. And lastly, we're doing some of that really high-level sort of modelling around nitrogen use efficiency there. So I'm around for the rest of the day. If you want to know any more about Strategic Farm Network, give me a shout. Update your preference centre if you're not getting those emails, and come along to David Aglin's if you'd like to. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I'll come back and tell you some more results at some point.
Morning, everybody. As Dave rightly says, this is a double act, myself and Henry Chryson. So we're going to talk about adding innovation and evidence to some of the integrated practices, things that we've talked about at these roadshows for many years, but how we can kind of take them into practice. And I'll go through some slides, briefly kind of introduce the subject, and then pass over to Henry, who's far more interesting than I am. Okay, so thinking about IPM, Fiona's touching it in some of her work, and Steve mentioned it in his. We're interested in things like cultivar crop genetics, how they can impact how you manage your crop. We've touched on crop hygiene. Henry's going to mention some of these other components like tillage system, cover crops, and other aspects. It all leads into intelligence, how we monitor the crops, how we monitor the progression of diseases and pathogens. I guess this is the important one for us, is thinking how this all contributes to decision support systems, regenerative agriculture risk modifiers, bringing on to control. Okay, so this is where your input comes in terms of your control, and I'll touch on some of the work we've been doing with biologicals. You've heard all from Fiona about the impact of chemistry, how important that is, and ultimately, of course, it leads to the outcome. So performance, sustainability, and most importantly, profitability. We're not doing this for philanthropic reasons, we're doing it to create a profit. Okay, so why are we interested in alternatives? A couple of maps here. So the top one is the biostimulant market in terms of growth rate and geography in 2021. Hope you can make out that, but that shows the highest growth rate for the biostimulant market is in Europe, America not far behind, lowest probably in Africa. That's in biostimulants. You'll know yourself there's a vast increase in the interest in using biostimulants in crops, and there's a lot more potential products coming to market, and no doubt you'll have heard many times from people who offer you the next best thing since sliced bread. This is quite interesting. The bottom map, of course, is the biopesticides market. So you can just about make out in this. So Europe at this point is trailing behind perhaps North America and Asia in terms of development and the market share of biopesticides, but this is something that we'll probably see a big change in the next few years. Okay, Europe will probably catch up, but the Americans and Asia are certainly ahead in terms of the use of biopesticides. Okay, so this is the way of the world. This is the way in which things are going. Okay, so this kind of sparks some of our interest in looking at some of these alternatives. One of the things we've been looking at is chitosan. So chitosan is an acetylated product produced from chitin, which is quite often found in crustacean shells. You can break it down, you can use it. You'll see it marketed as a biostimulant. This is some work done in controlled conditions. So these little bars here represent the rincosporium levels on flag, F-1, F-2. That's a chitosan treatment compared to a water treatment. So in terms of disease severity, you see you're getting a reduction in terms of rhynchosporium if you use the chitosan in controlled conditions. Some of the other products we've been interested in looking at, again, this is in controlled conditions. So Trianum is a Trichoderma herzianum species. It's marketed, it's registered, it's in the Green Book. It's marketed as a product which gives control of Rhizoctonia and some of the soil-borne organisms. Lalstop is a Streptomyces. Again, this is for control of Alternaria, Fusariums, and Rhizoctonias, but this was as applied as a foliar spray to control Rhynchosporium again. And you can see you've got reduction compared to the untreated, but just for comparative, we put in Fulpit. Fulpit, as you'll know, is a multi-site. It says Rhynchosporium control on the label, but you wouldn't pick it as your strongest fungicide. But that just shows you the kind of differences you'll see in levels of control. Okay, so this is one of the challenges of incorporating some of these other products. Don't expect the same kind of control you've seen from ag chems. You will get some control, but you'll have to build it in combination with other control factors to get that level of control you're used to from chemistry on its own. Okay, so briefly some graphs. We've been doing, those are control condition experiments. We've been looking at experiments in the field. And this is some yielded experiments. We have an untreated program and untreated with a very low fungicide input program. So laminarin is an exemplar of a resistant solicitor. It's marketed by UPL, has a label recommendation for control of mildew in wheat. That's laminarin with the fungicide. Serenade is a Bacillus subtilis. It's a biofungicide, again, in combination with reduced rate fungicide. AminoFlow is a biostimulant, which we've seen in previous trials at SRUC, can give a significant increase in spring barley yield if it's used late in the season. So that's AminoFlow again in combination with a low fungicide input. So because we're using the Serenade, we've had to use Amistar. So this is another challenge. If you're looking at biologicals, thinking in a crop protection program, there will be some products that with which they are incompatible in terms of fungicide. Okay, so Amistar you were allowed to use, but other ones you probably couldn't have used. So again, that's going to be another challenge in how you use them. Because the resistant solicitors are to induce the natural defense mechanisms in the plant, that's why we're looking at it as the T0 spray. So the question about T0s and the value of fungicides at T0, this might be an application date at which you might think about a resistance elicitor. Okay, so briefly, results from some of the trials last year. 2 sites, we looked at a Borders site. This is the one we're really interested in. So we've been looking at elicitors for a number of years. The thing which does come through most years, that elicitor, this elicitor on its own, these Rhynchosporium ramularia levels, the grey line is the yield. So you can see the elicitor and reduced rate giving a significant reduction in disease. Okay, and we see that better than any of the other products we looked at. But in 2023, we didn't see that significant increase in yield, unfortunately, but we have seen it in previous years. That's with Laureate, that's with Fairing. We wanted to look at 2 varieties. It's important you look at 2 varieties. Some of the resistant solicitors, other work has shown the response you get is going to be variety dependent. So you can't use an elicitor and think it's going to give me the same response in every variety. It won't. The response you get is a response to the genetics of the variety, and they differ obviously from variety to variety. Okay, we did the same trial at a Lanark trial site. Sadly here, strange year for disease, ramularia being the most important one that we saw in the trials. The control was a bit more variable, and we didn't see any significant difference in yield or disease control. Okay. We do some smaller plot work. It allows us to look at a wider range of treatments, of products. There's AminoFlow. We have them all on their own without fungicide. We have them all in combination with reduced rate fungicide. AQ10 is another biofungicide, Serenade. Microthiol is the sulfur product. Superphyte Plus is another resistance elicitor, and there's the chitosan on its own, okay? So we do this with 3 different varieties at our Midlothian site. These are results from 2023. The stars that you see, the biggest control, 3 is the laminarin on its own, 6 is the Cernade, 15 is the microthiol, okay? So differences, significant differences in terms of disease control. Because these are small plots, they're not taken to yield, but that's a response we see in 2023. We looked at Skyway as well, one of the newer spring barley varieties here. No significant difference. The biggest challenge in here was rust. No significant control in these trials. And fairing, and again, and if anything, fairing actually produced negative responses to some of these products, okay? And there was the laminarin again. So just what I was saying about, you have to think about the variety as part of it. You can't assume it's the same response. So something for us to think about, something to go back to the drawing board in terms of looking at these treatments. We were hoping that after 2 years of these trials, we'd have some clear favourites in terms of what would be the best to go forward and look at more trials. But I think based on what we've seen and the other plot trials, laminarin remains the most promising one in how you'd integrate it into a barley programme, and that is something that UPL are working on in terms of getting a registration for that product. Okay, so that's my last slide, and we'll have a short break while I disconnect myself and hand over to Henry.
Hello everyone. So I'm Henry Chryson, and I'm going to now start talking about how we can use some of the information that we've already had given to us today about variety selection, fungicide choice, and potentially the use of biological alternatives to fungicides as well in different systems. As Neil pointed out with the biologicals and the elicitors, even the variety can yield a different response. So if we put these in now different tillage systems, do we need to adjust our variety selection, our fungicide choice accordingly? So particularly, what diseases are we likely to experience more or less of a threat under different tillage systems, direct drill, min-till, plough? And then can we basically get the right components together that allows us to confidently pull back or where necessarily increase our fungicide input? Obviously, there's lots of other factors we need to consider: position, the rotation, the previous management of the crop and the stubbles, how long the system has been under a direct drill or min-till or plough-based system. All of these are going to have an effect, as well as the local environment as well. We've been doing trials in winter barley over the last 3 years, and kindly funded by the Mainzer Lawson Trust. This is a collaboration with James Hutton. We're looking at 3 different tillage regimes: so a plough-based system, a direct drill in which we rake some of the straw off, some of that crop residue off, and then another system where we just leave it on. A couple of different varieties, one more resistant than the other to the main threat, Rhynchosporium. And we've got 4 different fungicide programs ranging from a 0 to a 3 spray program. We completed the last of the 3 harvest years last year, and this has been conducted at 2 different sites in Fife and Perthshire. One in Leven, which has been in direct drill for 20 plus years, and then one at the back of James Hutton in Dundee, which has been ploughed for about 20 years until the year before this trial, in which it was in min-till, as we're trying to control for as many factors as we can. So perhaps no surprise there that when we look at Rhynchosporium very early in the season, those that are direct drill, whether they've got straw raked off or the straw remaining, DDS straw remaining, there's more Rhynchosporium in these plots, and that makes sense. There's more trash on the surface, there's more initial inoculum. So yeah, certainly early in the season, there's more Rhynchosporium. In 2 of the 3 years, at some of the sites anyway, there was more powdery mildew in the ploughed plots earlier on as well. So it's not to say that one's more disease prone than the other, but they're different diseases. Sometimes they're coming at different times as well. All things we need to consider. So now looking at yield. I mentioned the Hutton site, which has been ploughed historically. There's a big difference between the direct drill yields and the ploughed yields, and this is not uncommon. We kind of expect this to happen for 3, 4, 5 years at least as people transition from a plough-based system to the direct drill system. Lots of things need to happen in the soil to sort of allow for the benefits to come through. And that's what we're seeing at the Leven site as well. We see marginal difference between the yields at, comparing the direct drill and the plough year. The system and the soil is very much adapted to this form of cultivation. I've put a little star there according to the most profitable programme. You'll notice at the Hutton site, the most profitable programme was to not spray anything at all. There are other things limiting yield there, and the diseases are present, but other things are having a much bigger effect. Soil type, some signs it can be grass weeds, not uncommon in a direct drill system. Whereas actually when you look at the Leven site, which has been historically direct drilled, you'll see there's an incremental increase in yield for every fungicide timing and the direct drill. Crucially, there's that yield benefit from that T0, that pre-stem extension spray, because of that early threat of Rhynchosporium. And then looking at the plough-based system, there wasn't that benefit of having that early spray, so a 2-spray program, T1, T2, is the most profitable. So quite stark differences in terms of what fungicides are required according to the disease threats under these systems over the same years. So now moving to spring barley. This is a trial we have set up our Bog Hall site just outside of Edinburgh. And here, now we're looking to see in a more regenerative type of system, not really my favourite word to use, but we're looking at now, say, min-till along the top, and then the plough beneath that. This is a continuous spring barley trial with the same variety, laureate, grown throughout the entire trial, and the plots are sown in exactly the same space every year for 4 years. As soon as that spring barley is harvested, we're drilling a cover crop in, and that cover crop is either a hairy vetch, a mustard, a radish, or we're just leaving it fallow as our control as well. There are slight differences in terms of the establishment of these crops under the different tillage regimes. Hairy vetch does seem to struggle a little bit more under the reduced till system, but we've tried this twice now, and the cover crops have established well, which I know is sometimes a concern, putting cover crops in front of spring barley in Scotland. You'll see that the cover crop plots are split into 5 separate plots, and that's so we can put different crop protection programs in place. So either no fungicide, the biological that's been promising in a lot of our trials, Serenade, with a T2, as Neil said. They're not going to be a complete replacement, but you might be able to pull back on your fungicide inputs, particularly early on in the program, as long as there's that fungicide at the end to clear up. The elicitor laminarin, same with a T2 fungicide afterwards. Just the T2 and a T1 plus T2. And these trial, sort of grant in the audience, this is will be on show at the Bayer Open Days, which I don't know if we've got a date for this summer yet. No, sometime in the summer there'll be an open day, so feel free to come and see this. Looking at the yield data, same again, when looking at the min-till versus the ploughed yields. The ploughed yields are much greater. This is only 1 year's worth of trials, so pinch of salt. But potentially by the end of the year, at the end of the trial, 4 years, we might see those differences potentially anyway sort of level out. We are seeing a benefit of the different crop protection programs. Some seem to be better than that. I don't want to read in too much of it because it's just 1 year's worth of data. But there's no effect of the cover crop at this moment in time. Again, there might be something, if we keep putting on hairy vetch or mustard onto the same plots, we might see sort of a benefit or not over time as well. The main reason we've got these trials is looking at disease, so we're looking at the fusariums in particular. Some of the cover crops we have, particularly hairy vetch, has shown some promise in some trials at being able to control fusarium, or at least limit the spread to the following crop. We looked at fusarium on the plant and also in the soil, and found that there was more fusarium and more diversity of fusariums in the direct drill plots. So again, something else we need to be aware of, certainly if that does carry ahead and create problems on the ear. We'll continue looking at this over the next few years. We're also looking at other things within this trial as well, because we appreciate there's always trade-offs here, as we've talked about. We're looking at the beneficial insects, the pests, both on the ground and below the ground. We're measuring the cover crop growth using UAV imagery and these sorts of things as well. Trying to get as much out of that trial as we can, looking at the soils as well. So as a take-home message, many factors are going to affect plant health and our response, particularly we're talking fungicides and variety selection. we need to be thinking about how these work for your system. I mean, we do a lot of trials for looking at fungicides in susceptible varieties. We'll do a lot of trials looking at varieties and high input systems, but we need to be able to distill that and work out what's best on your farm. We're starting to do that, I think, here by looking at how this works in different systems. More alternatives coming through and potentially available going forwards. Laminarin on label for wheat, should be for barley. We're hoping sometime in the next year or so. And yeah, always evaluating. IPM is an iterative process, preventing the pest, establishing, monitoring it, controlling it, and then evaluating that pest management program. And if you haven't done so already, please visit Plant Health Centre website. There's IPM plans on there you can complete for free. We're now going to briefly talk about incentivising IPM. There's a lot of support from industry. There's a note there from Carlsberg and Diageo as well, also looking to, amongst others, increase the use of regen barley in their products. There's also support from governments, both in England and hopefully in Scotland in a couple of years' time, for IPM, for measures that protect the soil. There's 4 already paid actions available in the SFI scheme in England. Producing an IPM plan, putting flower-rich margins in, growing companion crops, and committing to not spraying insecticides. This year they've also announced a couple of new ones, support for no-till farming, winter cover crops, and also robotics in weeding as well. I've been working with AHDAS and these DEFRA-funded projects over the last few years, and we've been doing surveys, workshops to try to identify what things people would like to see supported with government funds and what's actually going to lead to a change in practice on farm beyond the scheme. Down in England, they're looking to do something that's going to cover as many people as possible. So basically, anyone growing outdoor food crops should be able to sort of get into this and get involved in this scheme, which does create issues when trying to appease the horticulturalists and the arable farmers. So increasing the number of the crops in rotation was well supported by the arable community, but in the horticultural sector, sometimes they're only renting land for a year, sometimes less. You need to be able to be in control of that land for 3 years to get the benefits, the financial benefits from this scheme. So there was debate there. Companion cropping, not particularly popular for the high failure rate. Not using insecticides, probably restricted to cereals. No one's going to not spray insecticides on high-value veg or potato crops. Decision support systems and bioprotectants, a lot more available in the horticultural sector. Variety choice, we talked about, can be restricted by the markets, and it's more so in the horticultural sector than it is in the arable. Habitat for natural enemy, people are doing this quite often under other schemes already, and then IPM planning was valued by all because that's indiscriminate. What we found is that rather than having bundles of set actions, it was this flexibility that was really in demand, because you could have a bundle of 4 or 5 actions. If one of them is just not applicable to your farm, it creates a barrier, can stop you getting involved in the scheme altogether. So we've managed to work with them, and now you get paid for individual actions. And those are some of the payment rates. So you can get over £1,000 now for completing an IPM plan with your basis qualified agronomist and reviewing it on an annual basis. And there are some of the other payments that have come into place as well. This is constantly being developed, and we're working still with these projects with AHDAS to try to further develop and get new things on that list. So the question is now, thinking about the Ag Bill and what might come into effect 2025, 2026, what things do you want to see supported? Here are some of the options I've put up there, some of which are already in the Ag Bill. So there is a section on reducing synthetic inputs, and there are various different things mentioning around crop rotation and things like that. But crucially, what do you want? This is information that we'd like to gather today, and we can feed back to the Scottish Government. So you might have noticed these little calculator dealies on your desk. Please do grab hold of one. Okay, so the results are in, and front runner is pest and disease resistant varieties. This is exactly the same as we saw when we did this in Perthshire as well. It's the same thing we see when doing surveys, we're doing workshops. People want to be paid to grow these disease resistant varieties. Maybe that hopefully results in a pulling back on particularly on fungicides, but maybe other pesticides as well. But also got reducing the use of pesticides. Again, These sorts of things, this is why we talked about it as bundles. There are synergies here. If you do X, Y, Z, you're probably going to need less pesticide. So why not get paid twice? And then finally, IPM planning, well supported as well, good to see. And also having diverse rotations. We see this time and time again, and I think we've got enough evidence now that we can sort of report back that we're confident that this is what people want to be paid to do. And it potentially puts a bit of pressure on the industry, potentially plant breeders, recommended lists to sort of promote the use of these pest and disease resistant varieties and better support them through the trials, through the sort of low input trials that we talked about potentially being on the table later as well. Anything do you think we missed? Nutrition? With respect to disease control? Yeah, I mean it does optimal, and particularly not oversupplying with nutrients has an effect on some diseases like mildews and stuff like that. There's lots of other things we need to consider there. Seed rate and things like that, the growth habitat with the varieties. I like it, and it does come up, it's optimised nutrition, but I think it's quite hard to do in practice, and there are also other payments for nutrient planning and things like that. Liming, so getting the pH right, yeah.
pHs are getting lower and lower, especially with the heavier rainfall, because we've got a lot of farmers out.
Yeah. Again, I know there's definitely IPM benefits there to getting the optimal pH range and that. We're in this strange situation with IPM that a lot of the things we're doing under IPM cross over into other things as well, into more integrated crop management systems. But yeah, fully take that point that if you've got a healthier crop, usually you can get away without as much pesticide, for example.
So, hello, I'm Eleanor Kay. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Scottish Land and Estates, covering agriculture and climate change. So for those that don't know, SLE is a membership organisation. We represent rural business and land managers. So importantly, I'm not Scottish Government, so expect me to say there's more detail to come quite a bit in this presentation. So I'm going to cover the agricultural reform programme, the agricultural reform route map, a bit on the climate change plan, a bit of detail on future policy that we should expect to see more from sort of later this year, and then I'll leave time for questions. So straight into it. The agricultural reform programme I expect you will have all heard of. It was introduced in 2022. It followed a series of government consultations and is in 4 parts. So we have the route map, which provides a bit of detail on when current schemes will change and roughly how they may start to change. As we get to this replacement scheme, it's not very detailed. Then we have a list of measures. This is not a fixed list, but it's pulled from the recommendations of the sector groups that ran between 2021 and 2022. The measures for this are going to form part of the Tier 2 offering. But again, it's not a final list, and I know Lorna and Alice are going to cover some of the arable-focused measures in their session. One thing I can confirm, though, is that the civil servant teams are meeting with stakeholders, and we expect more consultation with the sector about this list of measures. Nothing is fixed. We then have a glossary of terms, not terribly exciting, but it's always good to know what definitions Scottish Government is using in its own work. So as a sector, we can push back when we don't agree. And then finally, we have the Preparing for Sustainable Farming Guidance. This is a set of measures that came as part of the National Test Programme. It includes money towards a carbon audit, soil sampling on Region 1 land, and support for more data use in suckler beef herds. Payment rates aren't great, but it can be paired with other things within the Farm Advisory Service suite of offers. And we are expecting it to end, it will end by the end of this year, but it's massively under-applied for. So if you have anything you think you would like to get more information on, it's worth having a look at these things that are available. The Farm Advisory Service things are rarely over-applied for too. I suggest take a go and see if it's worth it. We don't have much detail in this reform programme on anything beyond sort of 2026, and we don't really have a great deal of detail on what we get to 2026, and it is very much in development, which is good. We have an opportunity to influence this still, but it does make it much harder for you guys to plan. The Scottish Government has continued to commit that there will be no cliff edge, and that those already doing the sort of things that government want to support will be rewarded. I'm a little bit sceptical as to quite what level of reward will be available for those already doing good stuff. Not sceptical enough to advise you to undo any of it, but so sceptical to perhaps advise you make a plan but don't invest enormously right now. And I will continue to do an enormous amount of lobbying work to maintain that commitment from government. The future model is intended to support farmers and land managers to achieve 4 outcomes. So these are that food production is a productive sector and delivering sustainable food as part of the rural economy, that the sector is transitioning to net zero, that it's reducing greenhouse gases, and that there is a substantial regeneration of biodiversity, ecosystem, and soil health. So that's an awful lot that government is expecting of this new policy. We know that we will get a 4-tier system by the end, and that end is about 2027 for the transition. We expect by the start of next year we will have more detail. We will be working with the Tier 1. By 2026, Tier 2 will be added, and 2027 we'll have Tiers 3 and 4. So what happens from 2025? So Tier 1 will be a base level direct payment. This comes in from 2025. It's a universal entry-level payment for agricultural activity. There will be some minimum essential standards, very similar to current cross-compliance. And these will be in relation to sustainable farming activities, protecting the environment, animal health and welfare, and ensuring fair work. We have quite a few questions about that ensuring fair work part, and there's a lot of work going on with government to get more detail on that. These standards are intended to make businesses more efficient. And as I said, existing cross-compliance conditions will be maintained, and we expect to see some more as part of the new support framework. And some things could be delivered a little bit differently as they tweak the design process. For Tier 2, which we'll get from 2026, we have an enhanced level of direct payment. This is, again, universally accessible. We expect there to be a 50-50 split between Tier 1 and Tier 2 in terms of money. And it will be for those delivering above the base requirements. So things like outcomes for nature and climate improvement, recognition of wider land management. We don't quite know what that means. And it has this very long list of measures which is supposed to deliver flexibility for everyone to pick a suite of things that fits their holding, as opposed to ticking things randomly on a list to try and get the right points. For Tier 3, we have an elective payment. Again, this comes in 2027. This will be competitive or subject to certain criteria. Potentially, this is where we'll see things like new entrant grants or next generation grants. It's also where we'll probably get peat restoration and forestry expansion and more things like that, along with things linked to specific species, for instance. This is all linked to the outcomes that they put in the vision for agriculture. A very long document, but it might be worth having a look at if you haven't seen it. Tier 4 is designed as a complementary support of measures. It used to just sit underneath all the pillars, but it now has its own tier. This is going to deliver things like continuing professional development, advice, knowledge exchange, and will link to the wider outcomes of Tiers 1, 2, and 3. It's supposed to be designed to help land managers decide what they do for their Tier 1, 2, and 3 application. So we have this phased-in approach, which I've already sort of talked about. We know that everything stays the same for this year. We may get some minor tweaks towards the end of the year, but everything should be largely exactly the same. From 2025, we will start to see changes, and we are expecting to get things like a whole farm plan, which is going to be part of Tier 1. We're also going to get things like new protections for peatlands and wetlands as part of a new cross-compliance requirement. The whole farm plan will include things like a soil test, so they haven't decided exactly what the whole farm plan is going to be. They're currently consulting on it, and it's changed quite a bit from the first version. So what we're currently expecting is a soil health test, an animal health and welfare declaration, a carbon audit, a biodiversity audit, and an integrated pest management plan, all as part of your requirement to get your Tier 1 payment. This is, as I say, still in development. The consultation closes the end of February, and then we expect a broader consultation. But it looks like it's here to stay. And we'll have increased requirements for the suckler beef support scheme to link to things like calving intervals and other emission reduction plans for cattle. I've sort of covered this pretty much. One thing that we are also seeing is a review of the regions. We haven't got much detail on this, but we know that the government is reviewing the region classification of land. So how does the transition work? We know that we are going to see these existing schemes transition into a new set. The schemes don't disappear. This will not be, the less favoured area support, agri-environment schemes don't stop in 2025 and then restart in 2026. They will continue. We may get slight reductions in the scope of some of them to front load the schemes in 2026 and 2027. But again, we're very much waiting on the detail here. We hope that there will be much more detail provided very quickly. So this is what we have in the agricultural reform route map, is a guide as to when we should get more information. So we have already seen some of these things in 2023. We got an agricultural bill report from the consultation around the Highland Show time. We got a bit more information on the new conditions for basic payments, a bit more information on the new conditions for the voluntary coupled support. And then we got some more detail on the animal health and welfare options. For the first quarter of this year, we are expecting to get detailed conditionality for basic payment schemes. We're expecting to get detailed conditionality for the voluntary coupled support, as well as detail on the elective support that will be available from 2025. I expect by the Highland Show, we will probably have a payment strategy between 2025 and 2027. This will include payment windows as well as budgetary allocation and guidance for 2025 BPS and VCS. We should also get guidance on the other schemes that will be running in 2025, information on the new support that will be introduced in 2026, and information on any sort of anticipated small changes between now and 2026. Again, that's an awful lot of information that we are waiting for from Scottish Government. So to date, they have hit their windows of delivering this information at the very end of that window. So I expect it's March before we get anything in that first box, and it's June before we get anything in that second box. And I agree with the general view that doesn't deliver much time for us to make any detailed plans. I think there's enough information in the agricultural reform programme and the vision for agriculture as to what it is government intends to support. So there's enough information to start making a rough plan as to where your holding may need to start transitioning to, both in response to climate change pressure and in response to market pressure, and knowing roughly what Scottish Government thinks it wants in terms of regenerative agriculture. Exactly how those things play out on your holding, that detail just isn't available yet. So this is a really quick summary of what we're expecting in the next kind of 6 months. I think when it comes to things like the split of payments and the allocation of funding, we expect government has an awful lot of work to do to decide quite what balance it wants between food productive capacity and nature restoration. And this is increasingly important as they have they've all committed, both in Westminster and in Holyrood, to maintain and monitor food security. And when we look at the developing geopolitical situation and we look at the impacts of climate change on food throughout the world, I expect a renewed focus on things like food security and quite what that means for domestic supply. We've heard talk of where's this money going to go? Is it all going to go up the hill for nature restoration? Well, government can't afford to do that. What we're waiting on is the clarity as to how it delivers this. But we know that government is increasingly looking at food security and energy security as critical parts of national security, and that has never been more important in our memory, at least. So as we have this transition time, there are various things that we can utilise as we wait for the detail. So we have the Preparing for Sustainable Farming programme, we have the support from the Farm Advisory Service, we have the work of AHDB as well, and we have time to make a rough plan. And we know enough about new schemes to work out where we may want to put our efforts. But we also have time to look at some of the new market opportunities. Government is expecting to plug some of the gap in its budget, and there are gaps in its budget, through private finance options. And this isn't just carbon options through the peat carbon code or the woodland carbon code, or even some of the new developing hedge carbon codes and others. This is beyond that. This is compensatory planting schemes for trees and biodiversity projects from other private individuals. Government is prepared to look anywhere for private finance instead of allocating government money. Our general advice is when it comes to things like carbon units is validate them and don't sell them yet, which is a pretty standard line coming from the sector. But don't be surprised if government starts talking at private finance more. In terms of future policy, we already have an Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill. This is at stage 1, very early, plenty of opportunity to still influence it, and it definitely needs improvement. We are expecting a land reform bill. We should have had it at the end of last year. We should get it by March. In fact, we may have got some stuff today. I haven't read anything yet. The climate change plan, again, has been delayed by 6 months. Last time, this is where we saw the requirement for a whole farm plan. It's where we saw a requirement for national nitrogen balance sheets and a few other things. I'm expecting there to be more stuff in the climate change plan on things like livestock feed additives for methane and other things that we've already seen happen in England. I wouldn't be surprised if we get pressure for those. But again, that's quite delayed, and they're going to have to respond quite quickly when they get it out. We are still waiting on Good Food Nation secondary legislation. Potentially this has a market opportunity in terms of pushing government procurement to buy more domestic food. But that, along with the missing national food plan, is making it quite difficult to work out what the consumer is going to be being pushed to buy. We are also waiting, it's not a great one for waiting, we're also waiting for just transition sector plans on land use and agriculture. These are quite important pieces of work from the Just Transition Commission, along with the Scottish Government, to look at where they expect the sector to make changes and who should essentially foot the cost and what the impact's going to be. It's not a great sign that it's been delayed again, but we will keep an eye on what's going on. So we have this really helpful but quite scary graphic from the Agricultural Reform Programme. This sets out, from sort of now to 2032, all the policy changes that we as land managers are going to have to live with and try and get our heads around. So we have, as I've mentioned, climate change plan and biodiversity, the agricultural transition plan, land reform, all pushed from 2023 to 2024. We've got the agriculture bill, that's roughly following the right timescale, but within that we have commitments to reduce agricultural emissions by about 30% by 2030. We're not seeing the movement on that the government expects to see. It's not a legally binding target, but I expect they're going to want to try and deliver something in there. We have got another commitment for more forestry, although they cut the budget significantly. An awful lot of pressure on Scottish land. along with a real indecision from government as to what it wants the regional land use partnerships to deliver. Again, this has been delayed by another 6 months from the pilot schemes, but I don't put this up to scare people, but this is what I have to try and keep track of and look for the interactions that just don't work and try and flag it as much as I can. We have an agricultural bill. It is currently at stage 1. I gave evidence before Christmas and expecting there to be more evidence along with a debate in sort of February. A few sort of notable things in it. Government wanted to pass by summer. Looking at the other policy that comes in that will interact with it, I can't see this happening before sort of autumn time, and it does need some changes. The bill is in 5 parts. The main objective does at least include food production. The first version of the UK agricultural bill had no mention of food in it whatsoever. Scottish Government have learnt from the outcry that came with that. So to have food production on the face of the bill was really important. We also have a commitment from them to, Scottish ministers will have to produce a rural support plan. This will detail its 5-year plan as to how it's going to support the rural economy, not just agriculture, but broader than that as well. And they also have to produce a code of practice on sustainable and regenerative agriculture. This has a few concerns for us, mainly because at the moment there's nothing in there that stipulates that they have to have any sort of advice or guidance from the sector or academics as to quite how achievable any of this is. So that's one of the things that we'll be pushing for, and I know NFUS is pushing for as well. And then the commitment to deliver a continuing professional development requirement. This is quite a broad one, but it's quite a concerning one. There really isn't a plan for CPD, but to have it in the bill without any plan to back it up is certainly one that we're all watching out for. So I've kind of rushed through this, I do apologise. So how can we all sort of get involved? Whilst this is still all in development, there are lots of opportunities to feedback, and it's really important that we get feedback from land managers. It's much harder to push for changes when we don't know how things are currently not working. There are 2 government-backed engagement projects which I can share the links for, and we know that government plans to do a number of workshops as it finalises its tier 1, 2, 3 and 4. If you get an invite, I really recommend you go. If you get an invite to go to the regional land use partnerships, get there. They are rarely attended by land managers, and they are being heavily influenced by environmental NGOs and other advisors who don't get land management and are quite keen to take decision powers away from you. So please attend as many as you can. And when the likes of SLE or NFUS ask for you to sort of give us advice on or give us feedback on what's not working in terms of policies, please tell us all your grievances. It makes it infinitely easier to explain this to politicians when things just don't work. And now I've got plenty of time for questions.
I'm going to focus mostly today on the recommended list review that we did last year, the outputs of that review, and also what we're doing in response to the review. That's not part of the presentation. And then I'm going to finish with a couple of slides just about some things that are on the horizon. But starting off with a review. So we did the review last year. We sent out a questionnaire with the recommended list booklet last January, and we had over 900 responses to that questionnaire. We were pretty happy with that response rate. And 139 of those came from Scotland, so if you filled in one of those forms and sent it in or filled the responses in online, thank you for doing that. We need feedback from you as farmers and agronomists if we're going to produce the material that you want for your businesses. We also had some online focus groups and did some stakeholder interviews to get some more detailed information. And as often the case with these sorts of things, we ended up with a lot of new questions to ask. So during the summer, we went round to summer events and did more questionnaires and discussed with people, particularly around the booklet and the information and how it's presented. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a while. So what did you say to us? This slide shows, it's not particularly clear, but I'll run through the main points for you. Oh, not quite sure what's happening there. We asked the question, what are the most important factors when you're choosing a variety? And up at the top there, you chose in Scotland, this is just the Scottish data, yield in a farm system, in your farm system situation. That came up much higher than it did in the UK as a whole. Second was pest and disease resistance, which is perhaps not surprising with the loss of actives and resistance issues. And in the UK, that was the top thing that came out. We've then got regional performance in the Scottish data. And it's interesting, we've got regional performance and performance on your farm right at the top. In the UK, they came quite a lot further down. And I think that's probably explained by what we can see out the window. You've got a different climate out here. It's certainly not this cold down in the Midlands. You've got different soils. And you've got a different market, very much focused on the distilling market up here. So you've got a quite different situation up here than much of the rest of the UK. Agronomic features also near the top. That was very similar to the rest of the UK. And then yield, with and without fungicide, and everything else pretty similar to the rest of the UK. And in response to that fact that you put disease and pest resistance right near the top, and agronomic features are near the top, we've shifted the tables around a little bit. You won't be able to see it, but on the right-hand side there, we've moved that information from quite low down in the tables, where it used to be, right up to the top. So you've got treated yield, untreated yield, pest and disease resistance, and agronomic features right at the top, all that vital information together in the booklet. And you'll see that in the booklet when it comes out at the end of the month. We also asked you, what are the potential areas for improvement? Hopefully you can see that. We gave you some options, and we also gave some free text options. Here we've got the overall UK picture and also the Scottish picture, and then we've also pulled out the breeders' responses. And the interesting thing is we expected certain things to pop out as really important, but actually nothing really did. Everything got scored fairly similarly, except mixtures of the same species, so blends, which people don't seem to be as interested in as we thought. But everything else was fairly similar. Differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK, again, we've got that regional information coming out in these figures. And also, you're not so concerned about grass weeds, which again is perhaps not so surprising. Also, you don't have an issue with blackgrass up here. You've got sterile brome issues, but nothing like the blackgrass issues down south. The breeders had a slightly different point of view. The breeders are the ones bars at the bottom. Again, not brilliant to see, I'm afraid, but they were really keen on areas of improvement for consistency and stability of performance. I expect that is because they know varieties that are very consistent on farm, things like JB Diego and Gleam. They're the sort of varieties that stick around a long time and are very successful. They're also, interestingly, not at all interested in grass weeds. I suspect that's because they know it's actually very difficult to breed for competitiveness against weeds. One thing that came through very strongly in the questionnaire was requirement for more information on performance with lower inputs, and that was particularly nitrogen and also fungicides. The nitrogen is almost certainly to do with that massive spike we had in nitrogen prices, which followed the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's the line that goes right up and comes back down again. Yes, it has come down a long way, but still it's at historically high levels. So people are looking for ways to cut back on use of nitrogen. Pesticides, plant protection products is the similar coloured line that goes up slightly. Costs are increasing, we know that, and a lot of the products we've got left are not as effective as the ones we had in the past. So people are looking to cut back on fungicide programs as well. Both of those are quite challenging for us to look at. In terms of nitrogen, we've actually been talking about this for a number of years now. Within the RL, we've been talking to the breeders, and the breeders have told us, don't waste your time with nitrogen use efficiency. They've spent millions of euros across Europe trying to breed for nitrogen use efficiency. It's not very strongly controlled by genetics. Nevertheless, we have commissioned a research review to look at all the data on nitrogen use efficiency and see if there's anything we can do with that. So that's reporting in March, and we'll decide how to proceed with that depending on what that review says. In terms of lower inputs, and particularly around fungicides, the RL is regularly criticised because the treated trials get a very strong fungicide programme, and people want something that looks more like a farm programme. The challenge we have with that is what is your farm programme? Everyone in this room will have a different farm programme, and more importantly for trial situations, when you've got different varieties, you'll have the farm programme you'd put on those to be very different. If you consider something like Extaze and Skyscraper, you wouldn't put the same programme on those two varieties on the farm, so you can't put a different programme on every variety in a trial. So that's a very difficult thing for us to do in a trialling situation. Nevertheless, again, we've got a review going on there to see whether there's different ways that we can get you information about how varieties perform in a more farm-realistic fungicide programme. Something that came out strongly from the Scottish data, I've said this already, is regional performance, and also to an extent consistency and stability of performance. Consistency and stability of performance is something we've looked at in the past. In 2015, we commissioned James Hutton, the BIOS statistics people, to look at stability and consistency of performance. There are two issues with that. One is that there are lots of different measures of stability and consistency, so you have to understand what the numbers are telling you. That's something we could overcome. But there's also the fact that you don't necessarily know a variety has got a problem with stability of performance until it happens. So we have 2 years of national list trials followed by 1 year of trials in RL before a variety becomes recommended. So you might have a situation where you have a variety which performs very poorly in drought situations, but you don't hit a drought situation until the variety has been recommended. It looks stable, you get a drought year, and all of a sudden it looks like a very unstable variety. So there's a data issue as well with that. In terms of regionality, Scotland actually does pretty well with RL trials. The trials in general are spread according to the crop area, and the map on the right hand side there shows the wheat, treated wheat trials. But we put more trials in Scotland because you've got this unique situation up here, so we produce those northern recommendations. There are actually more trials than you would expect in Scotland. Actually, there's quite a lot in the Aberdeen area. We're also looking at the stats for regionality, again with James Hutton Institute and BIOS. There may be some way we can do slightly different statistics on the regional data to get a better estimate of yield performance within regions. That's something we're moving forwards with now. Another thing we asked was how can we improve the outputs of the recommended list? There's no good at doing fantastic trials, producing fantastic data if it's not in a form that you can readily access and readily use and make sense of. So we asked, what do you use most? Perhaps a little bit surprisingly in this era of digital material, the RL booklet still comes out by far and away as the most useful format, with over 80% of people using it. And again, I've pulled out the Scottish data separately. So we send out about 15,000 of those every year. If you don't get one posted to you, you can sign up today or sign up on the website and get one posted out to you. The new one is due out in the end of the month. Our harvest results are the second most widely used format. That's in-season results, trial by trial. And again, if you want that emailed out to you, you can get that emailed out to you, go onto the website and sign up for that. And then the online tables. And interestingly, in Scotland, you make much more use of the online tables than the UK as a whole. I'm assuming that is because you're much more digitally aware and forward-thinking in Scotland, and you don't use the booklet quite as much. You also seem to be more interested in trial demos. We don't actually do that many trial demos across the whole of the UK for various reasons, but there are a lot of demos that other people do, breeders, people at SRUC, Scottish Agronomy, and actually we encourage the trial operators, all our trials are contracted out, we encourage those trial operators to use trials for demonstration purposes. That may be a big event, that may be just local farmers and agronomists, but we do like people to go and look at the trials where that's a possibility. The RL app and the VST, the variety selection tools, they were things that came out of the last review. as for new digital ways of looking at information. And something that came out quite strongly across this review was that people wanted new ways to personalise the information. And the variety selection tools were supposed to be our answer to that after the last review. The fact they're only being used by about 20% of people suggests it hasn't quite worked. And I will be asking you in a little while to come and talk to me about why that's the case. But first, some of those changes, and again, I'm afraid you're not going to be able to see this very well, but we've made a change to the spring barley table, which is obviously particularly relevant up here. We had some concerns on the barley committee that I'm being recorded, so I need to choose my words quite carefully, that there may be some seed merchants who were selling varieties to farmers, saying they were malting varieties when in fact they were still under test for malting. And so when farmers came to sell those varieties, they found they actually weren't approved for malting, and so they had no market for them. The MAGB were also concerned, and the distillers to an extent, that this was happening because in the past we used to put all the varieties together in yield order, depending, no matter where they were in the testing system. So what we've done now is, again, you won't be able to see it, I'm afraid, because the quality of the screen's not great, but we've now got a group on the left-hand side as you look at the screen. That's the varieties that are fully approved. In the middle, we've got those that are fully approved. And those varieties that we've recommended on agronomic, but are still not recommended by the NBC, they're on a separate group on the right-hand side, down as under test. So it's very clear which varieties are approved, which varieties are only provisionally approved, and which varieties are still under test and may not have a market for malting. Another change we've made, and again, I'm sorry you're not going to be able to see the detail, but the detail isn't important, is we've feedback we got, particularly about the bigger table, so the wheat table especially, it was spread in the booklet over several pages. So if you were trying to look at a variety, you had to flip backwards and forwards between pages to try and look at that variety. People said that we wanted to see it all in one place. So what we've done is we've stripped out all the footers from each page, put those in one place separately. That's allowed us to compress the data, taken out all the repetitive data, and now you'll find when you get the booklet, all the data for each variety is on one page or one double page. You'll be able to look at all the information on one page, read straight down, no flipping backwards and forwards between pages. So that should make that much easier to use. We've also made a change to the app. As I said, the app came out of the last review. It replaced our pocketbooks, which were a physical publication. The app is much more functional. It's also much cheaper, and anyone can have the app. We had a very small run of the pocketbooks. Each page shows an individual variety. It has the same information as on the recommended list, but just in a single page format. But what you said is you wanted to be able to compare varieties side by side. So we've added what we're calling a compare feature. You can now select a variety, add it into a compare feature, and then you can see up to three varieties side by side and compare them directly. No more than three, because it's meant to be used on a phone. If you get more than three, the text becomes so small it's not really readable. So we've added that feature on. The app hasn't been updated with the new varieties yet. We've got so many ways of putting the information out there. It takes time to update them all, but the app should be updated with the new information today or tomorrow. If you haven't got the app, again, come and have a chat with me. I'll show you how to download the app. Obviously, it's free. It works offline. You don't need a signal because it just sits on your phone. And it's the most up-to-date version of the data. So on candidate varieties, where we can't necessarily show the data if they're not yet national listed, as soon as they're national listed, we update the app so it has the most up-to-date information on the candidates. This was a slightly surprising response. Again, unfortunately, you won't be able to see the detail of this. But we asked, are the number of varieties on the list about right? In the past, people have often said there were too many varieties on the list, and so we expected that again. But actually, the second line down there is farmers, and 80% of farmers said the number is about right, with only 15% saying there's too many, which we thought we were happy about that, but we were a little bit surprised. When we looked at the other groups there, agronomists, 44% of agronomists thought there were too many varieties on the list. And I guess for an agronomist, it makes your life a lot easier if you've only got a small number of varieties to be advising on. Interestingly, breeders, 41% of breeders thought there were too many varieties on the list. Now, I'm assuming they think there's too many of other people's varieties on the list, and all their varieties are perfectly justified being on the list. But clearly, they They think there are too many varieties on the list. And seed specialists and grain merchants, again, think there are too many varieties on the list. But I guess for them, it's just much easier to deal with a small number of varieties, particularly if they do seed multiplication with new varieties. They don't know whether a new variety is going to be successful or not, so they'd rather deal with smaller numbers of varieties. Having said a lot of people think there are too many varieties on the list, some people also come back and said, well, I'm still growing this variety, you've taken it off the list. Why have you taken it off? We don't want more varieties on the list, and we certainly don't want varieties hanging around which perhaps is only being grown by 1 in 100 people. But what we've done is to help those people, we've introduced a new tool onto the archive part of our page. Sorry, you won't be able to see that. But if you go onto archive now, you can search by crop on a variety by name, and it will tell you when that variety was first recommended, when it was last recommended. So if you're still growing that variety and you want to see information, you can go straight to the archive and know exactly where to get the information for that variety. Just a little bit of caution if you do that. Obviously, for the disease resistance data, that data may have changed, particularly things like yellow rust, but also things like septoria. We saw with the cougar race, break down the cougar resistance. So some of that disease resistance data on the older lists may be out of date. So just a word of caution on using that tool. We did ask you how you'd like the RL information to be improved, the outputs to be improved, because I said we know we're not hitting the mark entirely with all of these outputs. And this thing that came out really strongly was new ways to personalise information. That was strong both across the UK and in Scotland. And as I said, after the last review, we developed our variety selection tools, which is supposed to do exactly that thing. You can go into the tool, you can manipulate the data, you can change the importance of different characteristics, you can choose different soil types, you can choose different markets to get the varieties you want. But clearly it's not working. So what we're doing over this winter is going out and asking for more feedback, more detailed information. So how do you exactly want to be able to personalise information? So I'm going to be standing around in the back during the break and at lunchtime. I've got some examples of different digital tools, both our tools and tools that have been developed by other people. They do slightly different things. Some are more complex than others, some are quite simple. Please come and talk to me about what you want, how you want to personalise the data, because it's already been said by David, this is your money we're spending developing these tools. If they're not serving the purpose you want for them, then that's not helpful to anybody. So please come and talk to me, have a quick chat. I'll show you some of the things we can do, some of the things we might do, and let me know if they're what you're looking for. So that's the RL review. If you want to know anything more about the RL review, happy to answer some questions either at the end or later during the day, so come and chat to me. Just a couple of very quick slides on a little bit of horizon scanning. And this is the main topic that everyone is talking about at the moment. New breeding technologies, precision breeding, precision bred organisms, this whole new area of genetic modification, if you want to call it genetic modification, but using different techniques we've had before. At the moment, as you may well be aware, there is a bill going through the Parliament in Westminster, Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Act. That was submitted in March. It is going through the whole parliamentary process at the moment, but that will only apply to England. That bill will, if it goes through, will divide GMOs into two different tiers. There will be the new ones using the new techniques. These will be ones which could have been produced using traditional breeding techniques, but just happen to have used the new methodology, and they would have a very, very light regulatory framework. Then there would be tier 2, which would be perhaps your normal GMOs, your traditional GMOs, where you might be bringing genes in from a totally different species, and they would have a robust regulatory framework just as they do now. As I said, this would only apply to England. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have said they were not going to follow this bill and introduce something similar. Scotland has been very robust in the way it's rejected this bill. Spoke to Scottish Whisky Research Institute about the attitude of the distillers to this. They're very much acting as individual distillers, but for them it will be very much up to the customer what they do. Will a drinker of whisky want to drink whisky that's been produced by a barley variety which has been bred using these new breeding techniques? They don't know that yet, but they're and they're in a particularly difficult situation because obviously they're laying down whisky now, which is going to sit in a barrel for 10 or 12 years before it's drunk. So they need stability on this situation. As I said, Scotland has said it's not following England. It's going to stick with the EU situation, which is all GMOs are the same. But while England is going through its process, the EU is also conducting consultation on a very similar lines to what England is proposing. So EU and England could look very similar. Where that leaves Scotland, who knows? It's very much in flux at the moment. We could, in theory, end up in a situation where if Scotland sticks very rigidly with its current situation, no matter what the EU does, we could have varieties which could be grown in England but which couldn't be grown in Scotland. In theory, those varieties, or the products from those varieties, could be sold in Scotland, even though they couldn't be grown in Scotland, although the Scottish Government does dispute that. In terms of the breeders, we've spoken to the breeders and said if this legislation goes through, they could have varieties in the market within 6 to 7 years. We're using these new breeding technologies. They've got material sitting there waiting. But if the EU doesn't move, and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland don't move, England is too small a market for them to bother developing varieties just for England. So, I say, very much in flux at the moment. We'll see where that ends up. We do support a little bit of work on breeding. We used to do a lot more of this. A few years ago, we pulled back and put more money into KE, and we don't have very much research money at all these days. We are supporting a couple of things. Cabbage stem flea beetle, obviously not an issue up here. Starting to be a little bit of an issue in southern Scotland, but really an England problem. And also looking at trying to find durable resistance to yellow rust. Again, not really an issue up here, although we have seen quite a lot more yellow rust in southern Scotland in the last few years. So things are changing. Whether it's to do with climate change, who knows? But we are supporting some areas of breeding still. So in view of time, I'll skip over that summary slide and just go on to my final slide, which is oil committee vacancies. We have 3 committees which oversee the RL, make choices on varieties and about how we choose varieties. And those committees have the whole of the supply chain on, from end users, the millers, the maltsters, the distillers, right through to farmers and agronomists. And AHDB appoints some of those people onto those committees. We currently have vacancies on the barley and oats committee for a grain trader, or 2 grain traders, and a grower. And on the Oilseeds committee, we have a vacancy for a pathologist and a grower. If you're interested in sitting on those committees, they meet 3 times a year to make their decisions. If you're at all interested, please come and chat to me during the day. Those vacancies are still open. They're open until Friday of this week. So if you're interested, please come and chat to me about those. And that is it. Thank you.